I hope you're finding everything to your liking.
Oh my god. Holy shit.
The 3D Fallout games are, in my opinion, some of the best video games ever created. This franchise has been a staple of the gaming industry since 1997, and ever since I first played Fallout 4 many years back, it's been a staple for me personally as well. Fallout 4 is honestly one of the first real RPGs I've ever played. Okay, I know that many people will harp on me for saying that, considering that there's so many other video games that do a much better job at being RPGs than Fallout 3 and 4, but as somebody who had never touched a truly interactive game before Fallout 4, this game was just mind-blowing. Today though, I consider Fallout New Vegas to be my favorite video game of all time, and similar to the first time I ever played Fallout 4, it's completely expanded my view of what video games can do as a medium. And as you can tell by this unreasonably lengthy video, I absolutely love this franchise, and I have a lot I want to say about it. But okay, for all those non-Fallout affiliated persons out there, this franchise is of course that post-nuclear, atom punk, 1950s infused sci-fi, kind of mystical, depressing, yet darkly comical post-apocalyptic wonderland that takes elements from traditional RPGs and combines them with a first-person open world that employs immersion like no other. Yes, I purposely tried to summarize the entire game series in one sentence, and yes, it is still likely confusing as hell for a lot of you. But really quickly though, for those that need it, here's a history lesson about the series as a whole, and you can feel free to skip it. Hello everybody. So I initially wrote the script for this video back in September of 2022, and now obviously the video is releasing a year later in September of 2023. So I let the introduction of this video sort of play out in its original format, but since this video grew to be almost double what I originally expected it to be, I decided to add a sort of post-editing introduction right here. So to be very honest, this video is just a glorified review of Fallout New Vegas. But to understand why I put this video game on such a high pedestal, it's important to understand why I think the general Fallout series is really amazing. To understand all of this, in the first hour of this video or so, I analyze immersion, world building, and the general structure of the entire Fallout series. This allows me to sort of give everybody this base layer of understanding, but then once that's over, I just dive deep into Fallout New Vegas and why I think that game is so amazing. Although I don't recommend that you skip through many parts of this video because obviously the later parts rely on the earlier ones for contextualization, I just generally hope that you watch this whole video because there's parts throughout that I'm just really proud of. And by the way, if you ever see my actual face in this video, I recorded these segments months and months later when I'm finally done editing this huge project. And a little heads up, if you stick around for the very end, I have a little musical number for you that I just recorded. Anyways, let's continue where I left off, and let me give you a very quick history lesson about the Fallout series. The original Fallout game was an isometric open-world RPG created in 1997, and then Fallout 2 released shortly after in 1998. Even though the gameplay may be a little jank compared to modern game design, the series initially did two things extremely well, which was set up an entirely unique atmosphere, and make a truly interactive world with so many ways for both the player to interact with it, and ways for the player to customize themselves to be their own character. Now, for the most part, these games really won't be discussed that much in this video. You see, I'm mostly focusing on the things that the 3D games do. That being said, to get footage for the original games for this video, I went back and started playing through Fallout 1. As I was editing this video, I was incrementally playing Fallout 1 as well. Because of that, honestly, after this video is over, I might even make another video about Fallout 1. But anyway, still one of the things that you need to know about the original Fallout games is that they're still pretty good games. And even now, over 20 years later, they're still considered some of the best games of all time, and some of the best games in the series. Even though I'll always love Fallout New Vegas the most, and 4 will always have a soft spot in my heart because, as I mentioned earlier, it was the first truly interactive game I've ever played, oh my gosh, these original games are still really good. And just to set the tone for everything, I kind of want to just play some footage from the original Fallout game. This is footage from the very intro of the game.
Of me when you are all alone. Maybe the one who is waiting for you will prove untrue, then what will you do?
Even today, in 2022, about 25 years after this game was released, almost everything we know about Fallout, specifically the setting and the atmosphere, was all set up just in the opening few minutes of Fallout 1. Again, the most important thing to note about these first few games in the late 90s is that the dialogue, the moral choices, the setting, the atmosphere, all the things that we still think of when we think of Fallout today applies all the way back then at the very, very start of Fallout 1. Also, a lot of the small details, like the dude's leg twitching is so good. So even though these games may look very different, trust me, at their core, they are insanely similar. All things considered, other than maybe Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 1 and 2 still have some of the best RPG mechanics in the entire series. And looking back, again, it's obvious why the new games are still so inspired by them. So anyways, the original developers, Interplay, have some wonky things going on at their company, and so the development team is shifted to Black Isle Studios. Keep in mind, they're still under the publisher of Interplay, so it's still basically the same company. And this is where they create Fallout 2. But after making Fallout 2 and some other really good games, both Black Isle Studios and Interplay go out of business. Something important to note right now is how many of the people at Black Isle Studios that are responsible for the Fallout series end up making their own gaming company called Obsidian Entertainment. For instance, the founder of Black Isle Studios, Fergus Urquhart, is also one of the main founders of Obsidian Entertainment. Regardless, with both Interplay and Black Isle Studios sort of out of business, the franchise is sitting stagnant, dead in the water. And then of course, Fallout 3 is released in 2008 by new developers, Bethesda. Bethesda basically bought the property from its owners and turned the games into first-person RPGs. Bethesda, of course, already had a lot of experience with the first-person Elder Scrolls series, and so it makes sense for them to go down this route. Fallout 3 is considered to be an amazing game by many. Okay, so by now, a lot of the community has actually kind of turned against Fallout 3, as both narratively and mechanically, the game was a bit of a mess, especially looking back now, but of course it's still loved by many people, and it was a really good first push, especially for first-person RPGs, which were, and honestly still are, pretty rare. The two other notable 3D games in this series are Fallout New Vegas, a whole new game made in the same engine with the same assets as Fallout 3, but it was made by Obsidian, which as I mentioned earlier was a place where a lot of the original developers went to after their studios closed. This is not a Bethesda game, and that's why it's honestly one of the best ones. Jokes aside, most of the original devs knew what the series needed, and that's why many people, including me, consider it to be the best game in the 3D series by far. I mean by very, very far. And also, as I said earlier, it's my personal favorite game of all time. I'm hoping one of the million other Western RPGs I'm gonna play soon will fill my craving, but for now, New Vegas is in a league of its own. Okay, wait, hold up one second. So I briefly mentioned in this part of the video how Bethesda basically gave Obsidian the rights to make their own Fallout game, but I really don't want to understate how little influence Bethesda had on this game. Literally, from everything I can tell from the information given on the internet, Bethesda, other than having maybe 1 or 2 meetings with Obsidian, literally had nothing to do with the development of Fallout New Vegas. The story and the open world, it was literally all from Obsidian. Yes, Bethesda gave Obsidian the engine and the assets from Fallout 3, but even on top of that, Obsidian added things to make New Vegas really their own game. I'm coming in to say this now because this is obviously a lot more important later down in the video, but really just a great example of this is a recent Todd Howard interview that I've seen.
Fallout New Vegas, super well liked,
yeah,
very beloved over the years.
You know, look, love those guys. Fergus is one of I think one of the great people in the industry. And we've always had a great relationship with them. When the New Vegas thing came up, because we were going to be moving on to Skyrim, you know, hey, we want more Fallout. Like, another thing, this is a hit, what are you going to do next? We're like, Skyrim. And it was, hey, look, there's only one group that we really trust to do this. And it was awesome.
It was only ever Obsidian.
Correct.
Yeah.
Look,
very well.
We get lots of people saying that they would do it, even back then, like,
yeah,
hey, you should let us do this. And that was, for me, it was the only, it's either this group or nobody.
When I tell people that Fallout New Vegas is my favorite game, they say things like, yeah, I love Bethesda's games, I love the Elder Scrolls series and Fallout 3 and 4. And right here, I just want to explain my best how Fallout New Vegas, although technically published by Bethesda, the teams making it were so much more connected to this than they were that. Anyways, let's continue with the history lesson a bit. Now after this, Bethesda basically tried to take what New Vegas did, mix it with Fallout 3, and created Fallout 4 in 2015, which honestly, despite having many similar problems to 3, is pretty good. And as I explained earlier, it was my first forte into RPG games as a whole, so I owe it a lot. The updated engine and graphics makes Bethesda's emphasis on combat over a good narrative a lot more understandable. Okay, and that's it. There's no other Fallout games we need to talk about. Okay, so history lesson over. I think you get the point. You had 2 original games made a long time time ago, Bethesda buys the series, makes one game that's pretty good. A year later, the original devs try to make their own 3D game, and it comes out really good as well. And then a bit after that, Bethesda releases another game, and again, it's pretty good. Okay, so in terms of the thematic genre of the games, as I mentioned earlier, it varies greatly from atom punk, post-nuclear, and even cowboy and ancient Rome themes. This mishmash is absolutely abhorrent, but the games mix them together somehow seamlessly. You see, the setting of Fallout is basically if post-World War II America used nuclear power to create a whole different age of technological innovation, different than our own. Then, in 2077, after rising nuclear tension, there's an all-out nuclear war. By the way, the reason why 2077 looks so much like the 50s is because the series is taking a retrofuturism approach. But what this mostly means is that the world of 2077 isn't what it would actually be like if we slowly progress to 2077. It's what the people of the 1950s thought the year 2077 would look like. That's why things just look like the 50s but a little more atom punk infused. The nuclear war leaves the remnants of civilization grasping for new forms of power and infrastructure. This is the core sort of part of the game that you actually play through. The RPG elements give it some really great narratives and immersion, and the first-person perspective makes the world feel like it's really right there in front of you, with the screen being just a gateway into your character's eyes. I know it may not seem like that big of a deal, but the first-person perspective really makes the games that much more personal. When events unfold, you're right there, part of the action, and when somebody pulls you aside to start a conversation, they look directly at you, talking literally to you, with your character being, again, a window into this crazy world. Right now, try to think of a first-person RPG not created by Bethesda or former Bethesda devs. There's, I don't know, Deus Ex, Cyberpunk, all those hyper-specific immersive sims like Prey, Dishonored, and Deathloop. You get the point. Both the aesthetic and the type of game is something not too common, and surprisingly, this franchise has somehow become one of the most beloved and adored gaming franchises of all time. It's broken free from its niche and slid into mainstream gaming, which proves that this series does something different, unlike any other. Okay, so you sort of understand the history about the series, and you also understand a bit about how I feel about it. But now let me describe what the core of this video is going to be about. I'm trying to hone in on why this series is truly special, and later we'll be taking aside my favorite game in the series, New Vegas, which in my opinion exemplifies everything amazing about these games. Even though some parts of this video may be similar to a traditional game review, many parts will also cover subjects other content creators either don't talk about or don't really get into unless they're making like an hour-long review. I mean, again, look at the rest of the video that's left for you to watch. I'm obviously going to be a little more intricate and detailed than a 7-minute GameRanks review. By the way, that's not a bash on GameRanks. I love GameRanks. I watch them every time I go to the bathroom. This video is divided into two big parts. Each was initially going to be its own separate video, but once I realized how much each relied on each other, I combined them into this monstrosity. The first half of this video will be a discussion on immersion, world building, and more specifically a concept that I've coined as the 3 immersive layers of Fallout. This will basically describe why I think these games explore immersion like no other, and many parts of the second half of the video will rely on it for contextualization. I will be using the video games as evidence in the first part, but don't let that seem like I'm reviewing them. It's simply just to use them as evidence, and I'm going to be going more into that reviewing mindset in the second half of this video. The second half of the video will be a discussion of my favorite game in the franchise, Fallout New Vegas, and despite that part being a little bit like a regular review, as I mentioned earlier, I also plan to analyze things on a hopefully not too boring basis. Although that sounds a bit pretentious, New Vegas has so much symbolism and literary devices, like literal Bible references, that I think it makes sense to do so.
A day will come when our Lord returns to judge us all. For many of us, the road is a difficult one, but the path is always there for us to follow.
I normally wouldn't describe the overarching plan for a video and let the parts play out as they go, but again, because of that, I think you guys deserve some knowledge of what you're getting into. Here's some important timestamps to know what's going on, and YouTube's card feature should separate the segments in your timeline. Anyways, this video is hopefully sectioned off well enough that my obtuse ramblings are easy-ish to catch on to. But without further ado, here's my discussion on the Fallout series, a game franchise like no other. Let's start by talking about immersion, shall we? Okay, so this first section of the video, as I mentioned earlier, will dive deep into something that I like to call the 3 immersive layers of Fallout. Put very simply, these are the 3 layers of the game world that I think go together to make Fallout what it is. Basically, the layers of world building. Also, for those of you who still aren't really accustomed with this franchise yet, don't worry, this will be pretty easy to follow. An analogy I'll be using throughout this entire section of the video will be comparing the immersive structure of Fallout to a pizza. Just like a pizza, the only way the sauce can be put on is if the crust below it is stable, and the toppings on top of the pizza is only there because the sauce and crust is stable enough to hold it. For Fallout, the crust is the lore of the universe from before the war. The second layer, the sauce, is the factions of the wasteland. And the final layer, the cheese and toppings, are the world building of the world itself, the physical world that you adventure through. The player interacts with the top layer the most, and as you go down to the crust, the player is more and more disconnected from the actual gameplay. But nonetheless, if it wasn't for those base layers, the entire sense of immersion through the top layers wouldn't work at all. Even though sometimes in these games it feels like you're just wandering through an empty wasteland with no connection to the past at all, the background information is always subtly connected. The people and environment around you is all there because another layer of lore exists. For instance, there's no quests or items to obtain in this part of the game if there was no Brotherhood of Steel, and the Brotherhood of Steel only exists because of the events of the war and the nuclear apocalypse. And hell, you can make so many more connections between the world and the lore. As you can tell, the lore and information only gets more muddled the further down you go, but again, it all relies on some sort of background lore knowledge. That's what the layers of immersion are. These immersive layers matter so much because this is a damn RPG series. In something like Far Cry, a crazy zany event can occur because, hey, it's a zany fun video game. In many other games, anything can happen because it's a video game. And even though this happens in RPGs sometimes, especially in RPG series like Fallout, everything needs to be grounded. Everything needs to make some sort of sense. If not, then the mirage of immersion falls apart, and any attempt at world building is honestly fruitless. Some of you may bring up something like the Wild Wasteland perks in the games. This is an optional perk that allows for tons of crazy random events to happen, but that itself is tied into another reason why Fallout is such a good RPG series. The fact that the game is so customizable that you can literally roleplay as a crazy person. In every game though, there's often some pretty silly stories that can occur, like the little ghoul kid in the fridge, or the baseball guy who thinks that baseball was about like killing people or something. Okay, but really quickly though, know that these are both from Fallout 4 made by Bethesda.
One team would beat the other team to death.
Even though these are mostly just examples of Bethesda's fucking terrible writing, still, unlike the zany events that occur in many other game franchises, the ghoul kid is set in the lore that, well, these zombie-like ghouls can exist in the wasteland, and the baseball guy, who somehow has no way to learn about what baseball is in a giant baseball stadium, is still a great example of how disconnected the modern-day wastelands are to the pre-war world, and they use the old technology in whatever way they must to survive. Oh, and really quickly, I guess it's important to explain exactly what immersion is, or the type of immersion I'm talking about, so that we're all on the same page. Basically, every single video game ever created has a type of immersion. Even the most basic game has the ability to suck you in and enter a flow state where the outside world ceases to exist. For some games, like let's say a match-based multiplayer shooter, the immersion is throughout the entire game session, but once a match ends, you become self-aware of the experience that's taking place, and the immersion is broken until you step foot into another match.
Ding, 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 dong, dong. Oh, what's going on?
For other games, the immersion is still a flow state, but the world itself needs to have a coherent set of rules so that you can believe everything exists for much longer. This is something that single-player games rely on a lot more. RPGs, games like Fallout, need you to believe that the world actually exists, and even further, need you to feel like your direct actions affect the world around you. It's in the name, roleplay. You are taking part in a role in the game. Although this definition may sound pretty broad, like you technically roleplay as Spider-Man in the Spider-Man games, but RPGs and thus Fallout need to take that extra step of player interaction, and combine that with gameplay and story design and quest design to make an experience that's almost like a sandbox narrative. The path of the game doesn't just have to account for what the developers want the player to do, but what the player wants the player to do. This may be more of a Western RPG definition, but I'll stop here so we can continue with the meat of what I'm trying to say. Fallout's immersion and the layers of world building are special, to me at least, and all of that immersion starts with the crust of the pizza, the base layer that upholds everything else the game is trying to do. Fallout's crust is everything that happened before the Great War and around the time that the bombs dropped. This is the nitty-gritty stuff that only YouTube lore analyzers seem to care about, but believe me, this crust is a hell of a lot more important than you think, especially for what you actually play throughout the games. Oh, and by the way, I know I've mentioned many things like ghouls and factions that occur in this game, but now that the video is actually getting started, I promise that whenever I mention something, I'll really dive deep into what they actually are so that all viewers can understand what I'm talking about. So anyways, now let's dive into the very first layer of what makes Fallout Fallout, the crust. Before there was a nuclear wasteland with politically diverse and obtuse factions, there was a complex pre-war scenario involving tensions between all of the world's superpowers. Even though the games do have tons of lore in this department, for instance there's computers that somehow still work, I think that this facet of the crust actually isn't as important in terms of whether or not you engage with it on your average playthrough. What is important is simply the fact that it's there. As you'll see later, the factions and people formed out of the war is the real narrative and focus of the games. But then what's the point of the deeper lore? Well, the reason is around you literally all the time. Even though if you turn off your head, sometimes the Fallout games feel like just a post-nuclear version of modern-day America, the true aesthetic underneath, as I've mentioned already, is that 50s-esque Atom Punk feel. Now don't get me wrong, the original games do play into the sci-fi aesthetic. I just beat Fallout 1, and it's obvious that these themes still exist in some form. But still, those original games don't really have you scouring through rubbled buildings and through computers as often. You see, the few times in Fallout 1 that you're sort of scouring through the remains of the pre-war ashes, it's almost always some deep underground bunker. But you see, in the 3D Fallout games, there's so many more buildings. There's so many more places that existed before the war that are still standing that you can go through. More importantly, the 3D games have a lot heavier emphasis on that Atom Punk feel, and it's really interesting to see how these games take this to their advantage. A good example of this is the Vault Boy character. This is a character created by the Vault-Tec company, who is responsible for the vaults all along the wasteland. These are the vaults where most of the main characters that you play as in the main games come from. Not only are they responsible for the large-scale survival of the human race, but also some deeper lore is that they could even be responsible for the war itself. You get the point, they're very important. I'll talk more about the vaults that they created later, but what's really interesting is that vault aesthetic, and also the Vault Boy character in general. You see, I feel like these really only became the really big face of Fallout when Bethesda got the series. I mean, if you take a look at the original Fallout games, they don't really show him off that much. They show off a radioactive symbol, they show off the power armor, but then, once you go to Fallout 3, there's Vault Boy right there. Same thing with Fallout 4 and especially Fallout 76. On one hand, yeah, this could be because Bethesda believed they could make a lot of money off of this mascot, but overall, I also think that it just shows the big aesthetic difference between the 3D games and the 2D games. Even though Vault Boy was there in the original games, it was much more of a hint of what once was in the past. A silly cartoon that sort of ironically shows off the past. And then the 3D games hit, and they dove a lot deeper into that crust layer of the lore. What I'm trying to say is that basically the newer games, the 3D games, want to emphasize that 50s Atom Punk feel a lot more than the 2D games did. This also then ties into what is the main true underlying aesthetic of Fallout. Again, even though there is some Atom Punk, there's still some other stuff in there that's kind of hard to describe.
Darla, where are you going?
Home, Skinny, where I should have been all this time.
American history was literally exactly like our own until the Cold War. But still, the bombs dropped in the year 2077, yet they were still in that 50s era aesthetic. Also, because of the heightened war tensions because of the threat made by other nations, the sort of Cold War hysteria that you got into the later 1900s is heightened by a lot. If you know about history, then you know about how America was basically overtaken by that Cold War fever. This is a lot like that, but with more nuclear inventions. But here's the thing. And I really hate to say this about the series, but it feels like it's all on a case-by-case basis in terms of how 50s and how futuristic the aesthetic is. Specifically, Bethesda's additions to the series seem to be a lot more 50s inspired. I mean, look at the house that you start off in at the very start of Fallout 4. This is the year 2077, and other than a few gadgets, it's literally just a 50s era house. But then other games seem to have this more crazy science fiction theme. Here's one of my favorite Fallout videos ever. It's called Bethesda Never Understood Fallout, and it's by the content creator Seamus Young. This video does an amazing job at describing what Bethesda thought the aesthetic was, and then what the original developers thought the aesthetic was. And before I play the clip, I want to acknowledge that this content creator has recently passed. Even though I only discovered this channel and this video after his passing, they're really good videos to watch, so I'm gonna have links in the description. Anyways, here's a clip of how he describes the difference between the original developers' understanding of the universe and then Bethesda's understanding.
Fallout is not about the 1950s. In Bethesda's games, the idea seems to be that Fallout takes place in a world where the bombs fell in the 1950s. Or rather, in a world where the culture of the 1950s lasted an extra 120 years, and even endured through the apocalypse. That's actually a really backwards way of thinking about it. The first Fallout game was actually a really clever example of retrofuturism. To explain what I'm talking about, take a look at these images. These are concept drawings made by artists in 1899, speculating on what the world of 2000 would look like. The time difference between these artists and the world they were imagining is almost as extreme as the difference between the 1950s and the day the bombs fell on the world of Fallout. As silly as they look now, to the people at the tail end of the Victorian period, these images of the year 2000 really did look like the future. And that's what the world of Fallout is. It's not the 1950s, It's the year 2077 as the people of the 1950s would have imagined it. But wait, it's actually more complicated than that. It's actually the world of 2077 as the people of 1997 imagined the people of 1950 would have imagined it. Actually, it's even more subtle. It's that world, but then that world was nuked into rubble and spent 84 years trying to claw its way back towards civilization.
Okay, I think one of the most important things to take note of is what the original themes of Fallout were supposed to be. A post-nuclear world, built upon what the people of the 50s thought the future would be like. There is a 50s aesthetic, not because the games are set in the 50s, or in a world where the 50s continued because of weird cultural reasons, but because people who lived in the 50s viewed the future as just a more technologically advanced 50s. Now I guess I'll start pulling specific places and aesthetics from the games that show off how this thematic choice is both confused and left back in the 3D games. Fallout 3 is in my opinion one of the least futuristic, most 50s infused games in the series. A great example is the downtown areas of the game, which quite honestly feel like just a destroyed and ruined version of 1950s Washington DC. Even though there's tons of attempts to bring that retro-futurism feel to the game, for me these attempts are ultimately fruitless. It just ends up feeling like a 50s wasteland with sci-fi tech in the ruins. Fallout 4, in my opinion, solves this a lot better by making the architecture and ambiance a lot more science fiction feeling. But ultimately, I think that this whole thematic idea comes down to one thing, and that's the player. Some players are going to embrace the sci-fi with open arms, and then others are going to focus more on the wasteland and the 50s aesthetic. Okay, so what does this have to do with that first crust layer, the initial lore? You see, I think this does a really good job at setting this up for the player to decide. Even if a player doesn't look into the deeper lore, some definitely will want to, and the fact that it's there allows for both the player to be more engaged and interested in the universe, and it also honestly allows for all of those crazy zany parts of the game to occur. Everything is grounded in something because that crust layer is there. I'm not saying that every stupid thing in Fallout makes sense, but at least they try their best. Also, I really quickly want to mention that what was and still is one of my favorite ways the games sort of stick to that pre-war 50s feel is the music. The Fallout franchise gathers actual music from the 20s to 50s and makes them work really, really well. Hell, they even utilize it to change up the theme. For instance, Fallout New Vegas has that more sort of western cowboy-like feel. And so guess what? They play a lot of old country songs. And then on the New Vegas Strip, there's that big band, Frank Sinatra, heavy sound. Oh, also don't forget about some Elvis too. It all just builds on top of itself and it's so amazing. Oh, and also another reminder, remember the intro of Fallout 1? Literally all the way back there, they were using this very aesthetic music. There they used Maybe by the Ink Spots to immediately set this tone. It's just utterly amazing. As I mentioned earlier, in the world you can find remnants of the past. These are usually just computer terminals, skeletons, or just small environmental details that have obviously been standing since the war. And this is where the 3D games really pick up that crust layer of the lore. You see, you're literally right there in first-person perspective, scouring the ruins. This is a feeling that feels a lot more disconnected in the 2D games because they looked like that, but also just in general, that first-person perspective, it just brings you right into the action. Don't get me wrong, those original games have tons of style, but here it's literally me doing things myself. Also, as I mentioned, the 3D games strengthen that 50s Atom Punk aesthetic, and it really takes it out of the world and makes it a much more prominent feature. Even though, like I mentioned earlier, in the starting house area, it feels a lot more sort of 50s-like, still, as you're scouring the wastelands, things feel just it's that Atom Punk thing, it's so amazing. Many may argue that the fact that all of these old and ruined buildings are still standing show that these games rely too much on this crust layer of lore, but I think the fact that these are still here only strengthens the experience. Fallout 4 has small, pre-war environmental details in my opinion better than any other game in the franchise. Skeletons are laying around everywhere. There's a real sense of there being a world there before the bombs fell. Even though 3 has dozens of random side areas to explore, I feel like Fallout 4's locations are so much more dense and interesting. New Vegas has tons of interesting side areas as well. I think that these areas, more than Fallout 4 and 3, do a much better job at building up the world in general. My favorite places are those smaller areas away from big cities, like this drive-in theater with this really good body placement, and the very iconic Red Rocket with its terminal full of pre-war goodies. Even though many will pass by these areas and ignore it, the games make sure that the player knows these things exist. Here's a really good example. At the very start of Fallout 4, as you leave the vault, you have to use this computer terminal to open the door to the vault. Yes, you can simply press the button to open the door and escape, but right there in the same exact computer to open the door are a bunch of messages that sort of explain explain the purpose of the vault. That's when I'm pretty sure almost every single player said, wait, what is all this cryogenic stuff about? And read through and read all the bloody details that were going on in the vault. Actually, here, let's talk about the vaults for a second. This is going to be my last great example of the use of the crust layer in the games. Almost every core game in the franchise again has you start off in one of these vaults, and as you continue the games, you always find more that are littered below the surface of the wasteland. Fallout 3 and 4 both do a really good job at setting up the vault lore. 4 specifically, of course, starts off with that pre-war section with your spouse and child, yet as expected, things go wrong and you end up having to evacuate to your local vault. Oh, and quick side note, this is why I think that Fallout 4 is the best game to play first in the series. Unlike every other game, it really explains things much better, but I'll talk more about that later in the video. Both Vault 101, the opening vault from Fallout 3, and Vault 111, the starting vault from Fallout 4, were testing on the inhabitants within. Fallout 3's vault is a bit weird to talk about, as a core study of the vault wasn't all that weird or strange, but Fallout 4's Vault 111, on the other hand, is a great example of what Vault-Tec was really up to. This vault has the focus of cryogenically freezing people. This is why you're able to explore the wasteland over 100 years after the bombs fell, even though you were alive back when it happened. But why did Vault-Tec do this? And how were they able to do it in the first place? I'm no Fallout lore expert, but I've heard theories that Vault-Tec may have helped instigate the war in the first place. Although nuclear tensions were insanely high already, Vault-Tec would have instigated the dropping of the bombs, and thus forced people to take place in their vaults, which were actually insanely controlled experiments conducted on the remaining US populace. And with the help of the US government, Vault-Tec basically profited off of the destruction of the entirety of human civilization. This is interesting because this is where we really first see the theme of how there's a continuation of consumerism, fascism, and dictatorships even through the destruction of mankind. Humanity was literally destroyed, it's all over, but these ideologies prevailed and continues to take advantage of mankind literally hundreds of years after humanity should have been destroyed. Overall though, I think the vaults do one huge thing, and that's connect the events of the game to the pre-war world. As you explore these vault time capsules, you find how mankind was destroyed by those who control it, both above ground and below. But anyways, back on track, the pre-war world is by far one of the most important bases of information that sets up everything that occurs in the games. Without this, there would be no vaults, no wanderers, no factions, and honestly, possibly no nuclear apocalypse. So hopefully you understand the point of this layer of Fallout. But then, what are the next few layers? You see, the faction and the ideals that rose from the rubble are some of the greatest examples of this long-lost world. In the actual events of the game, the player is forced to pick sides with the remnants of the retrofuturism past. This is where we dive into the second layer of the Fallout pizza. This layer is that nice tomato sauce that holds everything above it. The next layer of Fallout are the factions and politics that rule the wasteland. The Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, the Minutemen, Caesar's Legion, the New California Republic. These are just a few of the many factions that control the wasteland, and through them, the developers explore different political ideologies and morals. Siding with one will inherently go against the morals and beliefs of others, and so often it's up to the player to choose who deserves control over the nuclear wasteland. The factions serve one of the most important purposes of the game series, and that's to create conflict, stories, and truly hone in on the core narratives. For every single 3D Fallout game, for most of the 3D Fallout games, the faction that you choose to side with and the story that goes along with that chosen faction makes the RPG experience truly unique. Fallout New Vegas is likely the only 3D game in the franchise to truly master this form of gameplay, as it's the only 3D Fallout game where the developers aren't scared to make you hated by other factions if you choose to side with another. You see, in Fallout 4, you can practically follow every single faction's questline until the very end, where only then do you have to ultimately decide who you want to support. And then in Fallout 3, you're basically forced to help the Brotherhood of Steel to achieve the main ending of the game. In Fallout New Vegas though, you can become hated by literally over a dozen different groups and factions. And the game doesn't care if that locks you out of another faction's questline. Hell, being hated by everybody is literally its own ending for the game. But that's more of a focus for the second half of this video. For now, I just want to establish the importance of the factions, and why they're so critical to bringing forth a truly immersive video game experience. In my pizza analogy, of course, the factions of the game is what I consider to be the sauce. It's those delicious tomato insides. On one hand, this is all resting on that previous layer of lore. All of the history of the world has built up to these factions. But on top of that, there's a lot more that's built on top of these factions. Without the factions, what's the reason to scour the wasteland? In fact, I'd say that this situation is very similar to how Ganondorf is used in Breath of the Wild. You see, Ganondorf prompts you to interact with the world. He's that looming threat that's always there and gives you a reason to want to explore. But unlike in Breath of the Wild, where Ganon is merely a presence pushing you along, The factions are ever constant in helping you make decisions. As I mentioned earlier, in Fallout 3 you are forced to side with the Brotherhood of Steel to push back the Enclave and restore the water purification plant. There is one outcome, one storyline, and very few decisions to make. The factions in Fallout 3 are for me practically non-existent. And even though there's many sides to the story, along with some interesting moral dilemmas, they never come full circle, and every player is eventually funneled into one school of thought. Fallout New Vegas, and thus Fallout 4 that learned from New Vegas, found out that the only way to make the player feel truly important is to give them those unique experiences. Based on who you want to help, different missions and different narratives arrive. In these narratives, there's a whole nother branch of choices to make, and thus the player is no longer a pawn going through a set path. You're truly a wanderer, doing whatever you think is right or killing everybody because it's fucking fun. A good example of this completely free story structure is again in Fallout New Vegas. By the way, if you're noticing a pattern with me constantly using this game as evidence, you're correct. Okay, so here's a quick anecdote that will describe how there's decisions to make inside of other decisions. The two big factions of the game that are battling over Hoover Dam and thus the Mojave Desert are the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion. The New California Republic, or NCR, is pretty much the basic good guys that I think a majority of players will follow in their first playthrough. This faction is formed out of that small Shady Sands community in Fallout 1, and eventually they were able to take over California under one flag. And in the events of New Vegas, you can see them start to spread their influence to the east. Now don't get me wrong, this faction has moral complications and pros and cons, especially considering that they're the faction that acts the most like the governments of the old world. They have bureaucracy and presidents. But that being said, they're mostly there to do what's right for the people. Mostly. And you truly have to think if what they're doing will actually be able to unify people. Anyways, the other side of the conflict is Caesar's Legion. This is a tribe ran under one man named Caesar. They have that whole Roman soldier aesthetic that I mentioned earlier. They rape and conquer everyone they come across and forcibly unify them under one flag. Yes, they're really terrible, they're literally slavers. But again, they're a lot more complex than my short description, and I'll likely re-explore all of this a lot more deeper in the second half of this video. Okay, so in this game, if you side with the NCR, you're given the task to deal with the Great Khans. These are a drug-dealing raider party that's drumming up problems for the NCR. That being said, unlike many other raider factions in the games, like the Vipers or Powder Gangers, they aren't quite immediately hostile to you. I know that you can side with the Powder Gangers and somewhat with the Vipers, but you don't really get the camaraderie and honesty that the Great Khans give. They end up feeling more just like a huge family. Now the Great Khans have decided to side with Caesar's Legion. This is almost entirely because Caesar lied to them. Basically, in an attempt to take over the NCR land, he promised the Great Khans that if they help him against the NCR, they will still be independent and still be able to be a great tribe, without all the problems that they face because of the NCR's bureaucracy. But that being said, this is such an obvious lie. If Caesar wins, he will definitely end up enslaving the Khans and taking over their land, enslaving the men, raping the women, and turning the children into mindless warriors. Anyways, this is where the real interesting shit happens, as you can do a ton of different things to solve this problem. No matter what, to get the NCR ending of the game, you have to deal with the Great Khans. But that doesn't mean you have to just kill all of them. You can do many things, like you can kill them, or you can convince them to side against Caesar. You can do this by getting evidence to show them why Caesar is lying, or just assassinate until the right people are in power. It's really complex and really cool.
The glory of the Great Khans will be restored. I won't hear any more talk against Caesar or his alliance. You've been doing good things for us. Let me see that. Filthy savages. Probably have to decimate the lot of them? Are these the words of our friend, Caesar? Great Khans, drive Caesar's dog out of our camp. If he's too slow to flee, kill him.
You've chosen to side with the NCR, but within that you can still make moral choices to see how you solve their problems. Choosing a side isn't as simple as picking one and doing exactly what they say. You can choose the way that you solve those individual problems themselves. The factions rule in this series simply because you're given choices within choices. Fallout 4 have many factions to choose from, but sadly each basically has their own set of pretty by-the-books missions that the player can't stray far away from. Not to mention, it's really easy, as I mentioned earlier, to follow the main questline for every single faction up to a certain point until you have to pick a single side. That makes the game not only feel lazy, but it makes it feel like Bethesda thinks you're a baby. RPGs are known for important, irreversible decisions, and it continuously feels like Bethesda doesn't have the balls to do any of them. Anyways, Bethesda slander aside, the factions of Fallout is what makes the overarching story and narrative an RPG, and more importantly, it's what makes the games, fun. But quickly, I need to emphasize that linear stories are in no way worse than this type of open RPG. Just like everything else in life, everything has its own pros and cons. So as an RPG, the game naturally needs to have these choices and interesting decisions. This is to make the world one step more believable, which is why the factions and politics are the second layer of immersion. An RPG story should be open for interpretation, and even though the factions and lore is set in stone, the way that the player interacts with both the factions and the choices within those factions allows them to make their own connections. As a player interacts with the storyline, they get to individually determine whether the risks and morals displayed in that story are good or bad. In more linearly focused games, like let's say the new God of War, the game is able to connect to so many people in the same exact way because players take exactly the message that the developers are trying to give them. Even though yes, people will connect to certain things on different levels, nonetheless, the game is usually trying to say one thing and it linearly expresses that. Movies and TV shows are even more specific, as viewers literally see the exact same thing as the viewer next to them. Video games allow for that added layer of player interactivity, and even further, games like Fallout allow the player to determine the story itself, and thus, the player can really determine the message of the game. Do you decide to go straight and kill Benny, or do you sit back and wander through the Mojave for dozens of hours like I did, peacefully drifting away in the dust, listening to music of a time long, long past? Okay, so the main factions along with the Wasteland are very politically diverse, but the best way to look at them is by finding their core goal and then finding the lengths that they'll go to reach it. Let's use an easy one, the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel is definitely the most iconic faction in the Fallout series, with their beautiful power armor that's now a MacGuffin. It helps show off both their technological prowess and their combat prowess. Beyond that, these devoted fundamentalists have a very strict set of rules to follow, and they have a very orderly chain of command. But most importantly, they have a very narcissistic view of those who live in the Wasteland. In Fallout 3, the main enemy of the Brotherhood of Steel are the hordes of super mutants. But in 4, this is shifted towards the synths. These are these man-made machines that are controlled by AI, and have the ability to take the form of any human being in the Wasteland. In some missions, they're often treated literally like shape-shifting doppelgangers. By the way, I'm still not entirely sure if the whole synth plot in Fallout 4 is an attempt to mirror slavery. I mean, the pro-synth faction is literally called the Underground Railroad. It's so obvious, but I refuse to think that Bethesda is that smart. I just googled it, and yes, it's a slavery analogy.
The Institute treats synths as property. That sounds like slavery. Exactly.
Okay, so the Brotherhood is focused on capturing and obtaining pre-war technology for themselves. It's both very easy for the player to understand their mindset, and even if they don't, the power armor is so cool that I'd side with them regardless. But the means that they will go through to achieve their goals is even more fun to look at. Fallout 3 views the Brotherhood as gods, but in 4, they're honestly portrayed as the villains. As I mentioned earlier, they're basically trying to kill the universe's representation of slaves. Yet again, it's Fallout New Vegas' job to actually show off how great of a faction the Brotherhood is. You see, in Fallout New Vegas, the Brotherhood is basically under lockdown in a secret facility after losing a battle at the Helos 1 facility. Helos 1 held many pre-war technological secrets, but because of their need to study it, they leave too late, and they're cut off by the NCR. And so this chapter of the Brotherhood needs your help to slowly rebuild. As you do work for them, you slowly find out that they've been sending troops to their death to scour the Wasteland. And then the few that remain are under complete lockdown in their secret base. Their need to study and research new technology has doomed them, and without the courier's help, they would have likely perished. Actually, all the way back in Fallout 1, they're in a very similar situation as well, as the Brotherhood again is in a secret base underground sending out troops to their death to get secrets of what happened before the war. It takes the main character to kill all of the big threats in the Wasteland and restore hope for them to realize that their technology could also be used for good. This is honestly one of the few places where I do commend Fallout 3 as well. You see, they basically skip this whole intro of hiding from the outside world, and instead they show them as this powerful force that actually uses their ability for the good of mankind. This makes the fact that you're forced aside to help them a lot more understandable. Throughout all of the games, you see the moral complications that arrive with how firm the Brotherhood is on their rules and ideas. Just like every other faction, you see how greed and corruption naturally forms when a faction or idea gets too much power. Few times you meet good influences for the Brotherhood, like Veronica, who knows that the Brotherhood has good in them, but knows that there needs to be a huge change for the Brotherhood for them to actually start using their ideologies for the good of society. This was just an example of a complex faction in the Fallout games. Fallout 3 has a few factions like the Brotherhood and Enclave, Fallout 4 has a few more like the Railroad, Institute, and Minutemen, and Fallout New Vegas basically has more than 10 whole factions to deal with. And overall, every single faction is so complex and detailed that they're just amazing. In the Wastelands, there's so many groups competing for power, but above all else, they make a great job at making the main narrative and core gameplay of the games that much more immersive and interesting. The factions create the tension, the urgency, the immersion, because interacting with them is the exact type of thing that me and many other players look for in an RPG. And I gotta say, as much as some games may do it better than others, the role of factions is always done really well in Fallout. It takes the first layer of background lore, and it grounds it in something a hell of a lot more impactful. The factions and politics that formed out of the nuclear rubble. Okay, but what's the final layer of immersion? I've discussed the deeper lore, I've explained how important the individual factions are, but now it's time for the final layer. The toppings on the pizza, and in the games, this is the most relevant and prominent part of immersion, that every game in the 3D series, yes, even Fallout 3, does beautifully. The final layer of immersion for Fallout are the Wastelands themselves. Oh shit. Oh shit. Oh no. Oh fuck. Oh shit. Fallout is almost entirely about the Wastelands, situations where you're scouring the remains of an old building, coming across roaming ghouls and having to kill the lingering life. You walk out and the sun is now setting, but you still have a far walk ahead of you. Once the sun goes down, you hear a slight howl in the distance. You know you're in danger, but there's no way out unless you fight. The final layer of Fallout are the Wastelands themselves, and by that I mean the physical environment that you actually explore in the games. The lore and factions are nothing more than just ideas or concepts, but the physical environment is everything brought to life. In terms of gameplay, the Wastelands are the most important part of the game because they harness all the mechanics and gameplay elements that make a video game. Anyways, almost everything that I described in the first two layers of immersion could be a description for a movie or TV show. In fact, as I speak, they're filming a Fallout TV show. Because of that, I think it's very important to analyze how the third layer, the Wastelands, really affect the gameplay of these open worlds and enhance the experience immersively. Okay, so gameplay loops are that loop of gameplay that replays over and over again in a video game. I've mentioned it many times in many videos before, and it's something that I feel like every single video game YouTuber talks about. For some video games, of course, it can be a quick 30-second loop of combat, but in our case with Fallout, they're usually lengthy 10-minute quests or missions. The gameplay varies from meticulously looting an old building or vault to discussing politics with the enemy. The gameplay in Fallout is extremely diverse, in the sense that in one scene there may be a huge fight, and then in the next it's a whole 30-minute dialogue segment. But no matter what, it's all grounded in one thing, and that's the Wasteland. The Wasteland is always around you. It's rooted in the deeper lore, it's rooted in the factions. But above all else, the final layer of immersion is the most present part of the game. The environment, the enemies, NPCs, communities, towns. These are all a part of the Wasteland, and it's exactly what makes Fallout, Fallout. I've mentioned this many times already, but the first-person perspective is that window into the open world. This is a fully 3D environment where you are right there interacting with the world. When you need to go to a menu, for instance your Pip-Boy, you literally bring up your arm and look at something that's in the world. It's not quite like immersive sim levels of immersion, but still everything is sort of rooted in the Wasteland. Similar to a game like, I don't know, Half-Life 1, the first-person perspective is nearly never broken. That is, unless you decide to go into third-person mode. Oh, also in Fallout 4, for some reason in dialogue, they always break the first-person perspective. It kind of works because that game is a lot more cinematic, but still, almost all the time you're looking in this first-person perspective. Also, from start to finish, you're almost always in complete control of your character. They never really take control out of the player's hands, and it really helps enforce the fact that you are controlling the story. I'll admit right now, a reason why I'm so captivated by these games and why I'll just sit down and explore aimlessly for hours is because despite knowing full well that I'm really not doing much, These worlds are just such a treat to explore. The communities have complex characters and means of interaction. Some towns may have nothing but just a general store, but others may have a completely complex infrastructure. Diamond City in Fallout 4 is a highlight of all the games. Every game attempts to have some sort of huge city or community, but Diamond City is one of the only ones that I feel like is set up to be truly believable. There's back alleys, clothing shops, weaponsmiths. There's a mayor and obviously a complex financial and legal system. There's rules and there's enforcers. The city of New Vegas in Fallout New Vegas is cool, but it ends up feeling sort of like a tourist trap that's filled with games. Oh, and look at this style of Diamond City. One of the most interesting aspects of video games is style versus graphics. And we've seen time and time again that a video game can age graphically, but if it has a style and it sticks with it and it's pretty and beautiful, it often can still look really, really good many years later. Even though I think games like Uncharted 4 are still some of the prettiest games on the market, someday those will be outmatched by even prettier looking games. But something like, I don't know, Parappa the Rappa, dude, that thing will stay relevant forever. It will always look pretty. And I think that even though Fallout is a very realistic game, it has a style. For instance, Fallout New Vegas has so many mods that enhance the graphics, but honestly, other than maybe enhancing the graphics for guns, I couldn't really see myself using many of these. I mean, look at some of the old Elder Scroll games as well. Those games look pretty dated, but they still have some sort of style. It's not rooted in something too realistic. It's a little bit sci-fi. It's pretty brown and gray, so that sort of helps. But nonetheless, I think that these games still look really, really good. I mean, maybe not the animations, but at least the style, it still holds up so well. Anyways, as I plunder random buildings in Fallout 4, I see all the context clues around the buildings. I can do my best to try to determine what the hell happened here. Very, very few times in gaming do environmental details add up to more than just clutter necessity. What I mean by clutter necessity is that some games feel like they have a need to put in a bunch of clutter. You'll see something very neat and detailed in the environment and think, well, of course that's there. This is a very detailed game. Of course there needs to be detailed clutter. But Fallout, on the other hand, takes these environments and really uses them. When I go through a building, I'm looking at the remaining dead bodies. I'm looking at the rooms and the setup of the building itself. I'm picturing all that went down before the war, with all the terminals, notes, and context clues. I'm often looking at all the things that happened when the bombs dropped. And of course, let's say if it's inhabited by a bunch of super mutants, I'm putting together a picture of how these creatures live. And guess what? The entire time that you're exploring this area, you're in your room, on your computer, peering into that window to make this believable world. Of course, it won't be as realistic as like, let's say, a VR game, but I can't stress enough how whenever you do something, you are doing it. Here's a quick anecdote of a story that occurred to me while playing through Fallout 4. To get footage for this video, I went back and replayed a lot of the game. And this sort of story helps describe why I love the environmental details so much. Okay, so in the early part of the game for the Minutemen faction, you need to help out random settlements across the wasteland. One of these early settlements asks you to take care of a raider party at an old industrial plant. After going through this beautifully made location, you'll ultimately stumble across the lead raider and a computer terminal. Here the player can read his logs and find out tons of the background lore of what exactly is happening here. The lore ties in with the mystical Mama Murphy, a Minutemen settler who has the power to read the future. It turns out the raiders know about this power, and have been giving out a drug called Jet to a bunch of test subjects to try to get the same magical result. As much as Mama Murphy is a really stupid character, this made me appreciate her just a little bit more. In Fallout 4, you'll get so many aha moments like this. They put you in the environment where you can create your own stories and narratives. This is something that they can do with dialogue as well. In fact, one of my favorite memories from all the Fallout games is in Fallout 1. Let me describe another situation that happened in Fallout 1 that I think describes why I love the dialogue so much. You see, this dude named Killian wanted to get rid of this other dude, Gizmo, from Junktown, because Gizmo is basically this terrible gambling dude. He gives you this recording device and has you talk to Gizmo to try to get information out of him. Okay, so here I am, I'm talking to Gizmo and trying to convince him to hire me to kill Killian. Little does he know, he's being recorded and I'm gonna give this information right back to Killian. Oh wait, what's this dialogue option? Could you say that again, please? This time into my coat pocket? What?
You're either real stupid or a real stupid spy. Doesn't matter, because now Izzo's gonna make you real dead.
Oh shit, it looks like his bodyguard Izzo, this big gruntled man who has been his top bodyguard for years, is coming at me. Oh, he missed twice. Well, now I can easily kill him and his boss. Great, hopefully these guys didn't hear me kill their boss with this loud-ass gun. I guess I'll put my weapon away and walk out here stealthily. Oh shit. and boom, everybody's dead and I go back to Killian for my reward. That's one of my favorite situations where the game really lets you create a story for yourself. I felt like I, the player, was really the catalyst for a ton of those actions. I chose to pick specific routes and choose different options. In both of these examples, for both Fallout 4 and in Fallout 1, I used my natural reasoning to do something that wasn't based in video game logic but was sort of naturally inquisitive. And I think it's interesting because many times in video games I always choose that really safe path. But throughout the Fallout games, I'm often just choosing random paths that I think are interesting. The game both sort of pushes you into different paths, but nonetheless, you always sort of have your own option to do things your way. And that's where the immersion and the RPG elements really come into shape. The Wasteland allows you to do things yourself. You can choose what loadout you want to do. You can choose what storyline you want to pick. You can choose what side quests you want to accept and don't accept, and every side quest usually has multiple endings and multiple ways to solve them. You can go into a town, kill everybody, and see what the repercussions are. I love Fallout, and one of the biggest reasons is because it gives you the options to do almost whatever you want. But then Dashman, why don't you just play another sandbox game? I know that there's many sandbox games on the market that have a lot more options and a lot more ways to create your own story. Well, the thing with Fallout is that they have the first 2 layers of immersion. They have a base set of lore, they have a base set of factions, and then you're put in there and are a catalyst for tons of things that happen. In Dwarf Fortress, you literally create your own faction. You create your own story, your own base. Whether it's good or bad, you end up creating something that's entirely your own. Fallout isn't entirely your own. It's a bunch of stories and things that the developers give you, and then you get to solve your way through them like a puzzle. Because of that, the experience is a lot more, I'd say, curated. In a way that it's not that hard to pick it up and get yourself interested and invested in something, but nonetheless, making your own thing and making your own imprint in the world takes a lot of time and effort, and it's fun and it's slow and methodical, and everything just works together like a pizza. Anyways, you likely get the point I'm trying to make by now, especially with this final layer of immersion. It puts the player right into the world and it ties everything together. But now, let's sort of take a look at the entirety of Fallout's immersion. Let's take a look at the full pizza. The Fallout pizza is not complete until every single part comes together. In the perfect bite of a pizza, you get every part individually and combined. You can taste the individual flavors, but you can't really imagine eating any one of them on their own. Every layer of immersion comes together and interacts with each other in some shape or form to create the ultimate immersive experience that is Fallout. The easiest example, something that I've mentioned multiple times by now, is how when you're scouring the wastelands, you're constantly going through the remnants of what civilization was before the war. Something that I very barely mentioned though was how the factions themselves are a representation of the ideals from before the war. The Brotherhood of Steel is here to protect that old technology. Many other factions like the NCR or Great Khans were born from the vaults. They are the direct ancestors of those who lived before the war. Thus, as you wander through the wasteland, which is the final layer of immersion, you interact with the factions, which are the second layer of immersion, which are themselves a representation of the pre-war world, which is of course that very first layer of immersion. At some point or another, it all connects. The layers and folds of world building, themes, and most importantly immersion come down on the player all at once. Each layer is constantly working with each other to create this great experience. But why does this all matter in the first place? You see, what the game is aiming to do altogether is to create an immersive experience where the world is as complex as the one that we have in real life. In the real world, there's different layers of things that affect you. The government, societal norms, day-to-day life. Yet you never think of any of it at all in correlation to yourself. These aren't layers, they're the actual world that happens and affects you in a multitude of ways. Yet an artificial video game can't do the same thing, and it has to in some way set up the world through these layers. It needs to set up specific rules and things so that the world does feel believable. This is one of the only ways a believable world can be made in video games. And that's why the Fallout series, these digital masterpieces, are some of the most immersive experiences out there. Just like in real life, when you're playing, you never really think of the layers of immersion. It's all a coherent experience that comes together in front of you. Many may argue that, unlike in real life, the lore and history of the world are all set in stone, and so players will never have a truly individual experience. It's all for the developers to set up a bunch of rules and boundaries to see what the player takes out of it. This is very, very untrue for Fallout, and RPGs and video games as a whole. Unlike any other type of media, players are truly encouraged to make their own perspective. In books and movies, you see one outcome and it's guided by a specific answer or theme. Yet the layers of immersion in video games create an idea for the player to discover, like let's say the preservation of technology with the Brotherhood of Steel, and then give them so many different perspectives and outcomes and different nuances inside the subject for the player to figure out on their own, that the player ultimately creates their own line of reasoning, their own outcome for any specific theme that the game wants to push. The developer may have instigated this thought process, but video games really allow the player to sort of figure things out for themselves. There's definitely books and movies that have tons of nuance and different perspectives, but nonetheless they give everything to the reader or viewer all at once. In video games, things can be missed out on, things can be experienced differently, and so it's a lot more nuanced. A great example of this is the Plant Vault, which is vault number 22. This is one of the most popular vaults in the entire game series for a reason. The player is initially tasked with finding and preserving this science technology that may help the NCR grow crops. This is really important because the Mojave is literally a desert, and being able to grow crops in this hostile environment is very important. So you go into this vault where there's a lot of plants and weird technology going on, yet you slowly find out how dangerous and harmful this tech can be for humanity. And thus, this is where you really get to choose the outcome of the story. You can choose to destroy it so that it doesn't hurt anybody ever again. Yet this very important valuable information is lost forever, where it might be useful to help them grow even more crops, or it could be abused and misused, and ultimately harmful for the human race. No matter what ending you choose, there's so many different ways to view what the nature of man is. Is it the nature of man to protect each other, or is it to abuse any power necessary to take advantage of others? Do you think the NCR has the power to use this technology for good, or will it only add to the number of ways they've mismanaged the Mojave? So basically, in the Wastelands, which is of course the final layer of immersion, you find the vaults, which connects to the first layer, and then the second layer of immersion, the factions, sort of helps iron it all out with some really good insight into humanity. It all comes together in the scenario I just described with some really interesting moral questions. You don't realize it until I tell you, but it has every single element of Fallout's immersion combined. It's all coming together, and most importantly, in a way where the developers don't push a single idea onto you. Okay, so I analyzed each layer on their own in individual segments. They're all individually done beautifully, and have reasons for existing on their own, yet nonetheless they all come together and interact with each other, and they create this coherent and magical experience where you're right there in the world having a grand old time. And that's what's special about Fallout for me. Now though, let's use this information I just gave to you. Every single Fallout game uses these layers of immersion to their advantage, and some definitely more than others. And I think the game that uses this information better than any other is Fallout New Vegas. I absolutely love Fallout New Vegas, and now, after I got that whole discussion on immersion behind me, I really want to talk about it on its own. Finally, it's time to talk about Fallout New Vegas. Let's fucking go! Shit, why the fuck did that say Fallout 4? I mean, of course I know why, I wrote this script, but why the hell did I put this segment in? Okay, so I really want to talk about Fallout New Vegas. That's the entire reason why I made this video, but just like how I usually recommend people play Fallout 4 before playing New Vegas, I think it would have been best to discuss Fallout 4 before New Vegas as well. Also, a lot of what I have to say about Fallout 4 applies to Fallout 3, and just generally speaking, I have a lot less experience with Fallout 3, and the internet has done a really good job at explaining why that game is bad to begin with. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend watching HBomberGuy's video on Fallout 3, and like, even though I don't agree with all of this dude's takes, a lot of what he has to say is really valid, and I think I might have even referenced some of what he said at earlier parts of this video already. Anyways, Fallout 3, in my opinion, isn't really that good, and especially isn't really that approachable. If you're looking for a really cool RPG experience, something that was presented in the original 2D games, then you really won't find it even nearly as good in Fallout 3. But then, why do I recommend people play Fallout 4, which many people think has many of the same pitfalls that Fallout 3 has? Okay, so Fallout 4 does a few things very well. First of all, it does an amazing amazing job at setting up the lore, as the game starts off with you living in a world before the bombs drop, which shows off that first layer of immersion. And then you're right there and you watch the bombs drop, and then you're pushed off into the wasteland. Not to mention the pacing of the game is really great because it starts you off at the top left corner of the map, which basically means as you work your way down, you'll be discovering more difficult areas as you go, and overall it's paced pretty well for beginners of this franchise. You very immediately meet the Minutemen, which is a really great faction to sort of learn about the world as you go along. And this, of course, is that second layer of immersion. And then, of course, you eventually start plundering through the world, which, of course, is that final layer of immersion. I mean, I told you all those layers would be important later. Anyways, hooray, new players now know everything they need to know about Fallout. And then you finish Fallout 4 and you're thinking, wow, this game was pretty good, but I wish they did a lot more with what we were given. And that's when you start going down the rabbit hole. Anyways, I think the fact that this game sort of eases players into the world by introducing each layer individually, one after another, means new players won't feel like they're being thrown into everything all at once. It's very digestible. Oh yeah, not to mention, I think this is the only Fallout game that plays really well. I mean, don't get me wrong, Fallout 3 and New Vegas work fine, but the combat's just... jeez. If it wasn't for the VAT system, they'd be a lot worse. So yeah, the combat loop in Fallout 4 is actually really fun. In fact, whenever I go back to play Fallout 4, it's the combat that I'm looking forward to the most. The weapons are alright, other than the fact that 90% of them are these hideous fucking pipe rifles. Okay, really quickly, I need to do this quick side rant. Who the fuck at Bethesda thought that these guns were a good fucking idea? I've seen so many people agree with me on the internet, and it's because these pipe rifle guns are this like new addition for 4, and they attempt to be cool homemade weaponry, but at the end of the day, they just look fucking terrible. In every other game in the franchise, guns looked like guns, for the most part. 10mm pistol. And it made you feel really happy when you get a new weapon because it looks so cool and visually and mechanically. Every time I see a stupid pipe rifle, it makes me absolutely furious. Look at this mess. The magazine is literally going into nothing. The bolt-in chamber is up here, and then the magazine's down here. It's literally an impossible gun design and would never work in real life. Side rant over, I guess. Anyways, the main story is pretty basic, as they basically took a side story from Fallout 3 and stretched it into a 10-hour quest line. The side quests are mostly bad and uninteresting, but at least the world and the side areas in Fallout 4 are really fun to explore. If you're new to Fallout, I recommend Fallout 4 for sure. I don't recommend that you take the time to explore the game too seriously, and explore as much or as little as you want. It's all up to you. Just have fun and learn about the game, learn about the setting. After 4, if you have the willpower, definitely play some of Fallout 3. Again, I don't have much to say about this game. I didn't really play through too much of it. I played through the main story, I played through as much side content as I could stomach, but the main story in Fallout 3 is really linear. I explained this earlier, but it feels like you're just gated into a single pathway, and it ruins the whole fact that this game is a quote-unquote RPG to begin with. And of course I love Fallout 1, but at the same time, it's not as applicable in my discussion about the 3D Fallout games, so if you actually really care what I have to say about the first Fallout game, I think I have a small section in my 2022 gaming overview article, but otherwise I'll save that for another time, or I don't fucking know. Okay, I've used tons of Fallout 4 footage at the start of this video for one big reason. Even though it's just another Fallout game, it feels a lot more Fallout than many of the other parts of the 3D games. I tried to explain earlier why it doesn't get a lot of things right, but a lot of this is adhering to what the player base already knows about the series. Don't get me wrong, it's not like it's a part of a completely different game series, but the stuff it does is definitely a lot less notable. I really like what this game does, but more importantly, it feels more approachable to new players compared to other games in the series, so please play Fallout 4 if you want to understand the series first, and then move on to New Vegas. This whole section is almost like me telling you guys, please don't rush into New Vegas because you heard that it's an amazing video game. I feel like there's so much pre-context you must have about the series before you rush into it, because in Fallout New Vegas, a lot of things aren't explained directly to the player. The setting itself, a lot of the weird mutants and mutations and things in the side areas, they aren't really explained to you unless you really look for them. It's something that the other games sort of tell you. The other games will tell you what ghouls are, they'll tell you what super mutants are, they'll tell you what all this weird technology is. But in Fallout New Vegas, you're expected to know what a lot of this is off the bat, and because of that, it's able to expand on things. It's able to expand and become an experience that's bigger than any other Fallout game I think that has been released to begin with. There is a reason why people love this game and love what it does more than any other Fallout game. One of those people, of course, as I've said multiple times, being me, and that's because it does things unlike any other Fallout game I've ever played. It's the best in the series. And the rest of this video is basically a huge plea from me to explain why Fallout New Vegas is one of the best games ever created. I hope you enjoy. And funnily enough, I think now it's time for the real part of the video to start. What, more than an hour in? Thank you guys for sticking around. Let's get to the shit. Hey, you liking the video so far? I sure hope you do, because there's a lot more for you to watch. So as I explained at the start of this video, right now you're finally hitting the big meat and bones of the video where I talk about Fallout New Vegas. But something that I kind of forgot to mention is how I'm structuring this part of the video. The first part was pretty basic because I talked about the 3 immersive layers of Fallout, but now the video is going to be a lot more free form. So it starts off with me talking about New Vegas in general, and then I talk about the general story arc of the game. Starting with the opening area of Goodsprings, and then going into the factions that you meet during your playthrough. And then the main story arc sort of ends with me talking about the New Vegas Strip. Then I talk more about the gameplay. I talk about the gunplay and the RPG elements of the game. And then another segment where I talk about Fallout 4's Raider problem. This is basically a weird way for me to explain why I think that New Vegas's combat is better than any other game in the series, even though it's pretty similar to the others. Once all that's over, I talk about the DLC, because the DLC is likely the most important part to really understand the true meaning of the game itself. But anyways, enough yip-yapping, let's get right into Fallout New Vegas.
To the town of our free rode a stranger one fine day.
Okay, let's start at the very beginning. Once you boot up the game, you see this intro that establishes the Mojave. It shows off all the factions that you're going to be interacting with very soon. Fallout 3 and 4 are set on the East Coast, yet the original games and New Vegas are all over here on the West Coast. Here's a quick video clip again from Seamus Young that I think explains why this is really important.
The first Fallout game took place in Southern California. It featured rad scorpions, Deathclaws, super mutants, and a small cult of technology fetishists called the Brotherhood of Steel. The locals used bottle caps as an ad hoc currency. Then the second game came out with the same lineup. At the time, I accepted this as a necessity of the short development cycle. The games were exactly a year apart, so I guess some asset reuse was inevitable, and it was understandable within the world. Fallout 2 still took place within California. Scorpions aren't too much of a stretch. Perhaps the Deathclaws and Brotherhood of Steel migrated, and yeah, the events of Fallout 1 kind of killed off the source of super mutants, but maybe there were still some stragglers left over. I saw it as a missed opportunity to do something different, but fine. But then Bethesda got the license. They set the next game over 2,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., and the next one even further away in Boston. Despite this, they brought the same collection of rad scorpions, Deathclaws, super mutants, and the Brotherhood of Steel. This makes a lot less sense. I mean, scorpions don't live within 1,000 miles of the Northeast. They even kept the idea of using bottle caps as currency. It would make much more sense, and be way more interesting, if all of the various isolated regions would each come up with different things to use as currency. But Bethesda was just reflexively copying all of the superficial elements without thinking about how the world would work.
Okay, so of course he says that the eastern parts of the game have a lot of things that are interesting because it's sort of improbable for them to have all this stuff. It feels like everything from the East Coast is copied from the West Coast. What's important though is that this sort of separates the games by lore, and thus New Vegas actually ties itself closer to the original games than the lore of the newer Fallout games. I mentioned earlier that the original devs of 1 and 2 worked on New Vegas, which is why it feels a lot more connected to these earlier games, and why it feels a lot more like a traditional PC RPG than Bethesda's newer games. I'll explain that more a bit later when I talk about the more RPG aspects of the game, but that's again really important to know from the very start. So there you are, deep in your own grave, with these unusual men that you don't know hovering above you. One spouts his philosophy, and already there's so much symbolism to pull apart. You, a simple courier, were tasked with nothing more than delivering a package across the Mojave, but somehow was tracked down and accidentally caught in this whole mess.
You've made your last delivery, kid. Sorry you got twisted up in this scene. From where you're kneeling must seem like an 18-carat run of bad luck. Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
You're shot in the head, and yet, You're reborn to live once more. If I had $1 for every time you can make a rebirth Jesus reference in modern video games, I'd be able to buy quite a few sandwiches. But again, I'll talk about this dude, Benny, later. What's important now is to know that him killing you is obviously not an act of pure malice. It's just another part of a job for him. He isn't really remorseful, but again, it's a part of just some grand scheme that's much greater than you. And as you'll soon figure out, it's also much bigger than Benny. Luckily, this nice robot named Victor drags you to safety, and Doc Mitchell is able to patch you up. You awaken, reborn in Goodsprings, Arizona. The start of the story, and the start of Fallout New Vegas.
I've wrangled and I've rambled and I've rodeoed around.
Goodsprings. Okay, so the kind Doc Mitchell has patched you up, and you set up your starting conditions for your character. You'll be able to reassign these traits later if you please, but unlike any other game I've played recently, these numbers and choices really do have pretty big influence into the entire rest of the playthrough. Well, I mean, of course you can end up changing things and mixing things around, but it feels like so many games have stats and numbers, but it really means nothing. And even if they do have numbers that mean something, for games like, let's say, God of War Ragnarok, all I'm trying to do is make these numbers go higher and higher. There's so many options in Fallout New Vegas, but I would just highly recommend sticking with your gut and trying to not be a jack of all trades. Getting at least 1 or 2 skills that you're a real master of makes the game so much more fun, and it makes your character feel really like your own. But of course, once you play through the game a few times, you'll understand the systems a lot better. So just stick with your gut and have fun to begin with. You're in the small town of Goodsprings, modeled after a real-life town that exists in the real world. Many buildings, structures, and some of the inhabitants, like this dude, were literally all thrown into the game based on some people and places that the devs found in their trips in these real places. Fallout New Vegas was modeled insanely closely to reality in actual Nevada, and a lot of its major areas and definitely its different regions are almost always modeled after some sort of real-life place. This act of truly tying a world into its real-life counterparts is pretty rare in games, but I think it adds not only a sense of realism, but for people who have lived in those real-life places, it adds an insane sense of immersion. Once I drove and flew around GTA 5 for my parents, who are really well acquainted with California and the LA area. Not only did they know a ton of the landmarks, but they even knew their way around the world, which is insane. What this type of world does in New Vegas is much more interesting than how GTA 5 does it though, and that's purely because it's an RPG. With these real-life places, they have points of interest like Hoover Dam or New Vegas itself, and thus these bigger areas will tie in deeper to the Fallout lore. The geography in New Vegas matters a lot because there's basically a war happening, and because of that, it's really interesting to see these real-life places have a real sense of importance in the video game. Anyways, you get the point. The details and locations are amazing in the open world. In Goodsprings, almost every first-time player will explore and obtain knowledge as to what this place is. You start off by thanking the people in the town for saving you, and then you end up learning both a lot more about the world and also the situation that Goodsprings is in. In Goodsprings, the nice and easy town is looking out to live their lives in peace. An outside gang though, the Powder Gangers, a group of escaped NCR prisoners who have taken over the close-by facility, are trying to take over the town and gain power. There's a specific person the Powder Gangers are after, Ringo, and he's taking secret refuge in Goodsprings. Despite him bringing the town a lot of trouble, the locals have promised to keep him safe for the time being. You, a simple courier, are tasked with solving the problem, but that doesn't imply what side you're gonna help out. Just like the rest of the game, you're shown the option of choice, and a choice within choices, a concept that I mentioned in the first half of this video. You can choose to help the people of Goodsprings. There's a lot of skill checks available to show the player that their skills can lead to many different solutions to many different problems, and it shows how important it is to really specify in some specific skills and not just be a jack of all trades, because some of these skill checks you won't be able to do and some of them you will. You could also choose to give up Ringo and help the Powder Gangers, but no matter what side you choose, you can determine the individual solutions within that narrative. And again, there's so many different choices and outcomes within this really minor conflict that from the very start, the developers are telling you all the different things that you can do throughout the entire game. Okay, so what's on display here is really fun. It's an age-old video game trick, which is to mirror the actual narrative of the game with the opening. For instance, in Zelda Breath of the Wild, the tutorial is an island where you're tasked to capture 4 small shrines and then climb a tower to face one grand, powerful, godlike being. Then, once you set off in the main game, you're tasked with capturing 4 huge shrines, and then finally going to the center to kill a great, powerful being being at the top of a tower. You can take many game narratives and gameplays and connect the tutorial to the overbearing task the entire game is going to be. And the reason why this is a great tool by game designers is it allows them to introduce many intricate things to the player that they need to know within the first few hours. Goodsprings is so iconic because of how it sets all of this up, but it doesn't feel like it's boxing the player into this situation. You can just leave Goodsprings and chase down the fucker who shot you in the head, or you can interact with this amazing narrative and explore all the interesting aspects that make Fallout New Vegas Fallout New Vegas. Something about Fallout 3 that I haven't mentioned yet is its opening.
Come on.
You're literally forced to do this whole intro into the vault, where you interact with a ton of situations and do many things that don't really completely mirror any part of the game. It's really just showing you off all the skills you can do. And because of that, once you leave the vault in Fallout 3, none of that matters ever again, and it basically never ever affects you in the main part of the game. In Fallout New Vegas, not only is the opening segment really easy to skip if you want to, but the narrative's enjoyable, and it's actually kind of important for the entirety of New Vegas. It's an entire town that you can return to, and your consequences based on who you decide to help will literally stick throughout the entire playthrough whenever you return to this place. And then Fallout 4 again opens with this sort of deeper lore part that I mentioned in the Fallout 4 section. And again, even though I think Fallout 4 does a really good job at setting up the entire world for new Fallout fans, Fallout New Vegas starts off very quickly with an overview of the factions and the wasteland, and it's enough to gain intrigue and show off many things that will be a big part of the game to come, not just what Fallout is. Fallout New Vegas has so many specific aspects that go into it, and it feels a lot more than a typical Fallout experience. In Fallout New Vegas, you immediately explore the wasteland and the people within it. You jump straight into that third layer of immersion, the wasteland, and what makes the intro so cool is because it doesn't tie the player down. It allows them to both learn about the game and also have something to follow, which is why the Goodsprings versus Powderganger narrative is one of the coolest things in the game. Okay, but where's the deeper lore? Okay, so in terms of the layers of immersion, Fallout New Vegas starts off showing off the second layer, the factions. And of course, as I mentioned, you're exploring the wasteland, which is the third layer. But where's the first layer? Where's the deeper lore? That's the thing. Again, Fallout New Vegas doesn't need to utilize this. The most important parts of the immersive layers, in my opinion, are of course the third and second layer. The deeper lore matters that it's there, but it doesn't matter that it's directly there for the player. In Fallout New Vegas, you can explore so many deeper parts of the lore, but it's not always there for you to reach on surface level, which is really great. Not to mention, in New Vegas, whenever the game has something to say about capitalism and the pre-war world, it says it through the factions that currently run the wasteland. It's really cool, and it builds on the layers and layers of immersion that I mentioned earlier, but again, I'll explore this as I explore the factions as we continue my playthrough. Now though, I need to make some sort of concession. You see, New Vegas is partly only so good because of the games that came out before it that set it up for success. In at least some way, Fallout 3, the game that I've rattled on countless times in this video, isn't completely terrible. Fallout 3 walked so Fallout New Vegas could run far away and make out with Fallout 3's crush behind the movie theater. Anyways, once you leave Goodsprings, you actually start to explore the world. You'll likely take this path down the map and have a good fun time exploring, and let me tell you, I certainly did. There's many towns and storylines you experience in a small section of the game. The sheer amount of content is huge, and I would honestly just sink into my chair and listen to all these amazing stories and characters talk for hours. But let's say you're an experienced player and you want to go straight to Benny, you can go up many different side paths. These are filled with loads of dangerous Cazadors and Deathclaws, and all the NPCs will directly tell you not to go this way. But experienced players can do that if they want.
Our path was set by the travel agency.
That's for schoolgirls. Now here's a route with some chest hair.
Now, no matter what you do, you'll eventually finally make your way to New Vegas and find that fucker that shot you in the head. The first act of the game is over, and you finally get to truly meet each one of the major factions in Fallout New Vegas. This is where the main storyline picks up. To be honest, on my first playthrough, it took me 20 hours alone to get to this main part of the game because of how much I loved exploring the world and all the intricate aspects of the Mojave. And anyways, we're here in New Vegas, and it's time to get to work. Okay, so before this next section starts, I want to say that I know that I was talking about factions earlier, but this part of the video is talking about how factions are specifically done really well in Fallout New Vegas. So while there I was talking about how the general series does the factions really well, here I'm sort of talking about how Fallout New Vegas uses them, especially to amplify the story that they're trying to tell. Let's get into it. The factions are of course the second layer of immersion, and as you all likely know already from the first half of this video, I think this layer of immersion is very important. But okay, what's this segment about? No, I'm not going to talk about every individual faction in depth, but I more so want to talk about how the game utilizes each and every one of the factions to tell a truly RPG-like story, something that no other game in the 3D series has done otherwise. Don't get me wrong, Fallout 4's factions can be a blast to interact with, but in terms of feeling like true groups of the Wasteland, New Vegas is the only one that comes close to what you'd expect from an RPG series. It's not that RPGs need to have these awesome factions, it's just the fact that every single Fallout game does have factions, and New Vegas is the only one that utilizes them in a truly RPG way. But first, let me talk about how you are introduced to each faction on your average playthrough. The New California Republic. The NCR is likely one of the most popular factions in the entirety of Fallout. I mean, I literally have their flag on my wall right now. Anyways, the first that you likely will hear about the NCR is from the people of Goodsprings, the town that I was talking about in the last segment. These people acknowledge that although the NCR does do a lot of good things, the group of Goodsprings mostly disagrees with the fact that there's a huge group running the entirety of the Mojave Desert.
The New California Republic. Bunch of settlers and soldiers coming in from the west, fixing on making Nevada their own. They can be right pushy, but the roads are safer because of them, so I tend to let it go. Not that I got a choice. They're protecting their own. Just happens to help us. They've been holding off this other group from the east, too.
Goodsprings is a faction in and of itself, and this is sort of interesting because you have this smaller community where everybody knows each other. This is a town that's able to run really well because everybody is really personal. Everybody knows the needs and priorities of everybody else. And then this huge government comes in, the NCR, and attempts to fix things themselves. And of course, they won't be able to do it as well as this small town. This alone is a really cool dynamic between two factions that, although you might not think about immediately, it's just one of many dynamics that shows off the amazing way that this game is able to show off politics and political structures and communities and whatnot. But anyways, then as you continue the game, you'll come across many NCR outposts and help him a lot before you eventually reach the New Vegas Strip. Okay, so the NCR is very obviously like the most ideal faction morally over many of the other factions in the game. As I mentioned earlier, although it is a huge republic with the main problem being that they're trying to control everybody under their nose, still you can look at their bureaucracy as still trying to sort of have a nice outcome. Okay, so I mentioned the Powder Gangers in the last segment, the group of escaped convicts that were terrorizing the town of Goodsprings. And the only reason why these guys are terrorizing Goodsprings is because the NCR was unable to keep them under control. This is something that I briefly mentioned, but it's likely really important when you see why the people of Goodsprings don't necessarily trust the NCR. Because the NCR is so huge and they have so many problems that they have to fix, and thus people like the people in Goodsprings are stuck dealing with their problems. In fact, one big thing that you'll continue to see, especially if you do the NCR ending of the game, is how the NCR's goal isn't necessarily to take over the Mojave. They want to have control and set laws for the people that live there. Despite this though, in reality, they're made up of a bunch of morally complex and sometimes emotionally unstable people. They're a huge bureaucracy, and so a lot of things slip through the cracks. There's people like this scientist that are literally idiots and just got a job because, well, everything is so disorganized, it's so easy to just make your way in and mess up the chain of command.
What else? I'm in charge. This whole operation depends on me. They were going door to door asking if anyone knew any scientists. I said look no further. They asked me if I knew anything about power plants. I said as much as anyone I had ever met. They asked me how well I understood theoretical physics. I said I had a theoretical degree in physics.
By some miracle, they've hired an imbecile to try and decipher the systems. He spent months working at one console trying to get the solar reflectors to track the sun. What he doesn't know is that the only thing the console controls is the plant's intercom system. I tried to tell him, but he insisted that the largest console had to be the most important.
This means that even though the NCR is sort of the technical best faction, the NCR is just as flawed as the rest of them in the game. Something really interesting is how the NCR and their government is actually really stable towards the west in California. After the events of Fallout 1, the Shady Sands community eventually turned into the NCR, which was a really good government. But then in New Vegas, we can see them heading east, and their attempt to get control in this area is what ultimately leads them to having many problems. Also, the NCR is really interesting because they're kind of replicating the type of republic that the world had in charge before the bombs dropped. It's a continuation of the type of government that you saw in the past, if not with a little more themes of communism and socialism. All of that being said, they're morally really right, but again, they just end up messing up. The NCR ending of the game is probably one of the most common for players to get, and allows for really interesting scenarios. Okay, but who are the people the NCR is fighting against? You see, the NCR basically has this land over here. They have control over the Hoover Dam, but across the Colorado River is Caesar's Legion, a vicious army that has a lot of land towards the east. And this vicious army is trying to take back the dam that was stolen from them. Okay, so essentially the way that the game works is there's a few main factions that you can choose the ending of. You can choose to either side with the NCR, get their ending, choose to go with the Caesar's Legion and get their ending, choose to go with Mr. House, who we'll talk about earlier, or the fourth option, which is essentially just a third party. Basically, you get to make your own political faction based on how you think the Mojave should be controlled. These four endings each have their own sort of intricacies inside of them that I'll be talking about more in a bit. Okay, so Caesar's Legion is made up of slaves, vicious warriors, mentally stunted man-children that were indoctrinated by force or from birth. You have kids running around being indoctrinated into the cause. This is the common evil of the Mojave, and every faction feels the need to either fight, fear, or turn to Caesar. The NCR does have a figurehead, a president.
Watch this kill cam! Watch this kill cam! Tyler jumps in front of it like
he wasn't aiming for me,
Secret Service! Get down, Mr. President! No!
But Caesar's Legion has a figurehead themselves, Caesar. Of course, this guy isn't at all connected to actual Roman culture. He basically learned about it from the ruins of the wasteland, and then applied that to his empire that he created. Caesar's Legion is only able to continue because of its growth. Its existence is only to grow, capture, kill groups and other factions, and take them into itself. Keep that in mind for later. Even though Caesar's Legion is a very sort of wrong faction, and is typically displayed as the obvious bad guy of the game, as you do their ending, you figure out that the reason why Caesar's Legion kind of makes sense is because the wasteland itself is already so broken. Inside of Caesar's camp, even though things are terrible, there's literally slaves everywhere, and people hanging on posts, there still is order, a type of order that you can't see anywhere else in the wasteland. So both the NCR and Caesar's Legion have their own endings, as I mentioned earlier. Then there's Mr. House. Mr. House is like a Walt Disney-esque 50s entrepreneur figurehead who wants nothing other than controlling the New Vegas Strip. You see, Mr. House really likes to preserve the pre-war beauty of the Strip. It's a symbol of the continuation of pre-war ideals. And then of course the Yes Men path, the sort of third party that I mentioned earlier, where you can sort of choose your own ending. Anyways, even though these are sort of the big factions to choose from, there are a ton of others in the game as well. There's the bazooka-toting boomers, there's the drug-taking fiends, the Great Khans, the powder gangers that I mentioned earlier, of course the Brotherhood of Steel, and quite a lot more in smaller towns and cities. There's groups of super mutants, there's groups of ghouls. Every type of person or type of ideal you can think of, it likely has a sort of faction in the game. Every ending of the game, interestingly, forces the player to deal with most of these factions. As you follow the questline for every single one of the endings, you sort of have to decide how to solve the problems of many of the other factions. And by problems, I mean whether they deserve to continue in the wasteland, or whether you should kill them and let them fade away. Something that I mentioned in the last part of this video is how in the Goodsprings segment of the game, you're able to choose many options inside of the main path. That's exactly what these smaller factions are. In the main ending of the game, whichever one you choose, you can choose the ending for every single individual faction, and inside of every single sub-faction, you can choose every sort of sub-ending that they achieve. Okay, so even though the game has a lot of these cool factions, why are New Vegas' individual factions like the NCR and Caesar's Legion so special? The best answer for this is in the DLC. It's sort of what I think ties the entire message of the game together. This is the big reason why I think it's important to talk about Fallout New Vegas, and the big message that I think it's trying to display. Despite that though, I think to talk about the DLC, I need to finish talking about the main story that involves a courier. I know that this is a huge cliffhanger to leave you off on, but trust me, the story of the NCR, Caesar's Legion, and all the smaller factions that roam New Vegas is something that takes a lot more background to truly understand. So anyways, after making your way out of Goodsprings and around the Mojave for a while, you finally make it to the New Vegas Strip. And in the New Vegas Strip, you finally meet every single one of the main factions in the game, and to start truly shaping the world of Fallout New Vegas. This is where the second act of the game starts, and where you truly start to shape the Mojave.
Settle down. Anybody wants to go to the toilet, go ahead now. All right, let him have it.
Once you finally reach the Strip and find Benny, the man who shot you in the head, you're also presented with the 4 main factions of the game that you can side with. The 4 main factions that I was talking about earlier. Let's start off with Benny though. Benny, despite calling you one in the intro of the game, is definitely one of the biggest pawns in the New Vegas narrative. In almost every single playthrough of the game, the courier almost completely dismembers him.
You'll pay for that.
Another kill to my name.
Despite this though, one good thing I can say about him is he's the perfect catalyst for the events of the game. Benny wants to rule New Vegas, and with the help of his robot friend Yes Man, created purely to say yes to what his superior wants, he's on the path of doing so. You, the courier, was sent to deliver a package along with 7 other couriers. Yet every single one of them but you was a decoy and was killed. You were the only one with the real package, that package containing the Platinum Chip. The Platinum Chip is an item that Mr. House is after. Mr. House being that Walt Disney-like character that I was talking about in the last part of the video. Something about Mr. House is that his main goal is basically just to preserve the Strip. Back before the bombs dropped, Mr. House ruled the New Vegas Strip. Or back then I guess it was the Las Vegas Strip. It was the place that he loved the most and the place where he had the most power. With Las Vegas under his finger, when the bombs dropped, he was able to protect it from the nuclear missiles. And that's why New Vegas is one of the only things still standing in the wasteland. Anyways, in the opening of the game, of course, Benny was intercepting the package and obtained the Platinum Chip. Mr. House wants to secure the chip because what the chip does is it makes his robot sentry army even more powerful. And using the chip, you can either destroy the robots or make them more powerful for Mr. House, or even possibly for yourself. Benny wants the chip to turn House's robots against him, and thus making him the sole ruler of New Vegas. Sadly though, as I mentioned earlier, Benny is himself a huge pawn in the game. Despite ironically wearing a checkerboard suit, he himself is a huge piece in the whole scheme of the game. He too is a slave to the ideology of power. The grasp for power is something that every single faction in the game falls under, and under the spell of the lore for power, Benny destroys almost any semblance of power that he had in the past. Benny, similar to many other powerful people on the Strip, is already really accomplished. He has his own casino. He's the ruler of one of the few families on the Strip, there being a few families that share the rule of New Vegas. The 4 families, of course, being Benny, who controls the Tops Casino, the Gamora Casino, the Ultralux Casino, and then of course Mr. House's casino that isn't open to the public. Despite already having power, just like Mr. House, this taste of complete domination is what drives Benny to his ultimate defeat. And this is the repeated theme that I see over and over in the game, but it's something that I'll touch more on later. Okay, so after meeting Mr. House, an NCR informant comes up and invites you to visit their local headquarters. And then after meeting Benny and the Yes Man, a secret legionary informant invites you to visit Caesar and the Legion. The game makes it obvious that visiting either side won't necessarily force you to side with them, and honestly at all times, no matter what ending you're going for, you can simply go evil, switch sides, and kill a bunch of people, and end up messing it up and going down a completely different path. The lack of hand-holding means that the world is very delicate at times, but it's still open to all kinds of interpretation. If something changes in your mind, you can change the path of the story almost at any instant. If you visit Caesar, you'll find Benny, who is captured with the Platinum Chip. Yet of course this only happens if you don't kill Benny first and steal the chip for yourself. Caesar sends you to destroy the robot upgrade bunker, but you could also alternatively go down there and help Mr. House to upgrade the robots. And then of course Caesar's Legion and Mr. House are only 2 of the possible endings for the game, so you can choose to either upgrade it or destroy it, and then still go against Caesar or Mr. House. The game's linear story is literally set up with so many checks and balances so that you aren't tied down to one playstyle and aren't tied down to one of the 4 possible endings. And again, as I was talking about a lot earlier, the different intricacies inside of each ending means that even if you choose one, you could morally be going down a different path. Okay, so whenever somebody talks about New Vegas, a huge percentage of the discussions are around these factions, most prominently the NCR and Caesar's Legion. Although I talked a lot about the factions earlier, the dynamic between these 2 factions becomes really more well done once you reach New Vegas. You've already seen different bases, different characters within the factions, the ranks and levels of each faction, and so then all the intricacies and really well done backstories and lore just ends up adding to this really interesting feeling that these factions are real. Each storyline can go a number of different ways. Each character can be dealt with and interacted with differently. Missions can be solved in a number of different ways. For instance, in each ending you have to deal with a Brotherhood of Steel, who I mentioned earlier were hiding out in a bunker. Now let's say you're doing the NCR ending of the game. You could choose to just kill the entire Brotherhood and that would fix the problem. Or you can choose to help help convince the Brotherhood and the NCR to band together against Caesar's Legion. If you do this, then in the ending of the game at the final Hoover Dam fight, then the Brotherhood comes and they help you fight against Caesar's Legion. Similarly, if you choose to upgrade the robots, they can be there to help you fight against Caesar's Legion or the NCR or whoever you choose to fight against. The game is so loose that it ends up opening up more options. And this all again culminates on the New Vegas Strip. You're introduced with every single main faction: Mr. House, the Yes Man, NCR, and Caesar's Legion. All the 4 endings are opened up to you, and they're all opened up at a very, very similar time. Unlike many other games in which the core decisions that choose the ending are kind of hidden, for instance, some games like, let's say, Cyberpunk 2077, even though many of your options do choose the ending that you achieve, there always feels to be some sort of hidden variable. There's some things that you didn't realize you were doing, but they end up influencing the ending. Of course, that might not be the best sort of example, so you can nitpick me here, but nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is that in New Vegas, you know exactly what you're getting into. When you do something and when you go to a certain group and you choose to side with them, you know exactly what you're doing. And the best part is that as you learn and as you interact with the factions, both the good parts and the bad parts open up to you. The Strip as a location represents a sort of revival of pre-war ideals. In fact, the entire game, every single faction partially represents some sort of continuation of ideas that were left from before the war. The Strip itself and the area surrounding it is an amazing location, because you can tell that once you hit the Strip, every single main faction finally gets involved. Because sure, before you had small towns and communities like Goodsprings, but they were all very individual stories, and only now you sort of have a lot of what they were saying, all of the messaging, all of the morals, all of the ideology, and it all comes together, so every single thing that you had done before sort of ends up influencing your final choice of who and of what ending you want to achieve. The Strip itself is surrounded by a community called Freeside, which although seemingly decrepit and terrible, is one of the most lively communities in the game. There's a faction here called the Kings, which are filled with a bunch of Elvis impersonators who don't even know who Elvis was, somehow, and they have a fun robot dog and dancing henchmen.
I'm the king. What can I do for you?
Despite it seeming all silly though, the fun ends there, and this gang ultimately is definitely one of the coolest and most serious to interact with and help within the game. Think of how Goodsprings is kind of against the NCR, because despite boasting power, the specific needs of Goodsprings can only be met by the people of the community. Freeside is one of the most broken towns in the entire game. There's kids roaming around all dirty and rats and criminals around every corner, but the Kings are able to establish some sort of order, and when other factions like the families of the casinos or the NCR come to lay down rules, you sort of see how the Kings as a faction matter a lot because they're able to really speak to the specific needs of Freeside.
A lot of folks around these parts who've been here a while resent the sheer number of people that have come into the area since the Strip was built. In turn, the newcomers, most of whom come from the NCR, have gotten ornery from being resented. Sometimes things get violent. This is one of those occasions. Recently, a few friends of mine were attacked, and I want you to find out who did it.
Then there's places like the Wrangler Bar, where you can get this dude a sex robot, and I'll just let the thing talk for itself.
Greetings. Festo is programmed to please. That will be 10 caps, please. Thank you. I am programmed for your pleasure. Servos active.
Then there's this terrible place called the Silver Rush, with these mafia-ass jerks who hurt my favorite companion character, so I let a man go inside and suicide bomb the place because I knew he was a bit sketchy.
Hey, looking for something to replace my old revolver? Thanks.
We're supposed to pat everyone down. Didn't you hear that part of my instructions?
Inside the Strip, one assumes the world would get more civilized. Hell, you literally need 2,000 chips in your wallet to be able to enter the Strip. But once you exit Freeside and enter the Strip, you see that the Strip is basically controlled by a few key factions, the families that I was talking about earlier. One is a sex den called Gomorrah, where you have an interesting quest where you have to bring 2 forbidden lovers together. Another, the Ultra Lux, hosts a secret cannibal society.
Mortimer wants to reintroduce humans into our cuisine.
Within this place, one subsect of the faction is trying to break away from their cannibal ways, and then the other are trying to keep up the tradition, and have a plan to trick the rest of the faction into eating delicious human meat.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
The tops, of course, is Benny's domain, which is really 1950s themed. It's kind of silly, but it works really well.
You've got a crazy drop on me here, baby. That's for sure.
And of course, we all know how that quest line goes. And then Mr. House is of course the fourth faction that's in primary control of the strip. Plot summary, plot summary, plot summary. Wow, this is hard to write. Okay, so boom. You're on the strip, you have the option to do a lot of side quests, do things like solving the problems of the families, and you have 4 fun factions to deal with. The NCR, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House, and of course the Yes Man. And again, up to this point, you're doing so many side quests and interesting things that your brain muscles are all flexed, and the morality of your character that you're playing, you really get immersed in the world and the philosophy of whatever faction you end up choosing. And then finally, just one more time, I want to go over the 4 factions and the 4 different branches that you go from here. So yeah, anyways, really quickly, I just want to talk about the 4 main paths, the 4 main endings, everything that branches from here, because if I was going to talk about every single one of them in depth, this video would be a lot longer, so let's just go over them very fast. Mr. House wants to strip, he's old and decrepit, and wants the last thing in the world that truly displays that pre-war Adam Punk Las Vegas beauty. As I showed though, the strip itself is a complete mess, so cleaning it up for Mr. House and helping him get ultimate control of the strip is his main goal. So by the end of the game, you're basically getting control of New Vegas for Mr. House so he can run the strip himself. The Yes Man ending is the default, oh my god, you're such a maniac ending. As mentioned, after you kill Benny, you meet the Yes Man, the robot guy that was helping him conquer New Vegas. Now that Benny's dead though, the Yes Man cucks over you, and he helps you conquer New Vegas yourself. This ending is basically entirely anarchy and edgy as hell, but mostly it's just used if you really disagree with all the other factions and you want to go your own way. The NCR ending is the most video gamey, even though the NCR does have flaws. Anyways, you help them defend against Caesar's Legion in the final battle over the Hoover Dam. The storyline itself has interesting missions like defending against an assassination attempt on the NCR president, and just like all the other endings, you have to deal with all the opposing factions and whatnot. With the pacing and climax of this ending, it's obvious that the developers put the most effort into the NCR and definitely favor them as a faction, and this is the main ending that I think of when I think of Fallout New Vegas. I mean, again, I have their flag on my wall. Finally, the Caesar's Legion storyline is, well, interesting. In this story, you're able to actually see the great and powerful Caesar a lot more, and something that's interesting is that he's actually pretty sickly and kind of incoherent half the time. It's messy, and it shows how truly broken the Legion is, despite trying to hide it from the outsiders, and it does a good job at fleshing out their part of the world. That's something that I really have to give New Vegas. Really, no ending and no part of the game feels really underbaked. Every single storyline is so dense with so much contradictions and interesting little parts that it feels so real. Anyways, again, in every single ending, you have to deal with factions like the Great Khans, the Brotherhood, the Boomers, Fiends, and the other families on the strip. Each faction has its pros and cons, and most importantly, the developers aren't scared to make you have to really choose between the factions in the battle for the strip and the Hoover Dam. In my Fallout 4 segment, I mentioned how for the most part, the game allows you to simultaneously complete so many different storylines for all the different factions of the game. Even if the factions are completely against each other, like the Institute and the Railroad and the Brotherhood, you're able to sort of follow each one of them close to their ending. Fallout New Vegas though, Fallout New Vegas doesn't fucking care. They don't care at all if you completely demonize yourself from the other factions and miss entire chunks of the game. A really good example is that if you miss a specific dialogue prompt with his character that you see on screen right now, it's a lot harder to find the Brotherhood of Steel until later in the game. This adds 2 things that Fallout 4 completely missed out on. On one hand, there's now this whole new layer of replayability. There's new characters, new missions, and basically an entire new lens to look through the game with. Every single playthrough adds a true sense of believability to the world. Being able to truly side with the different factions based on what you want to do means that the player is directly responsible for the outcome and path, which is exactly what a real RPG is supposed to do, unlike Fallout 4. The real battle for New Vegas climaxes as you explore the strip itself, and every single part of the narrative sort of diverges here. It's really perfect, and this climax works so well as you reach the climax of the entire world, the New Vegas Strip. Now though, to dive deep into the themes and analysis of New Vegas, I need to talk about the DLC. But before I do that, I have one of many sort of side rants sprinkled throughout this section of the video. One of the first big things that I'm surprised I haven't talked about at all yet in an hour and 30 minutes is the combat of Fallout New Vegas. So anyways, here we go. Let's talk about some gameplay. Let's talk about the combat of Fallout New Vegas. Oh my god, I haven't fucking talked about the fucking combat. I haven't talked about the gameplay. Oh my god, and it's been fucking... I'm having a mental breakdown. Thank you guys for watching this video up to this point. I'll continue. I'm sorry. Okay, so yeah, as much as I hype up the story, themes, and characters of Fallout New Vegas, I can't really do nearly as much to hype up the gameplay, or at least the combat specifically. The combat is alright and it works fine, but similar to Fallout 3, it was pretty much just like an Elder Scrolls game with clunky guns added. Strategizing in combat on where to be and what to do usually isn't that big of a deal, and everything just ends up being a big decision of who can tank the most damage, you or the meat puppet in front of you. And then once you get to a high enough level, and you have just a bunch of healing items in your inventory, the battle then becomes if you can even reach your inventory to heal before you just die. Anyways, that being said, if you spend enough time in the world like I did on my first playthrough, you end up becoming very, very overpowered, which is honestly always a lot of fun in any RPG. There's a lot of really interesting things about Fallout's combat that I think are worth noting. First of all, and possibly the biggest, is just the weapon design. Although this might not seem like the biggest deal, the weapon design in the Fallout series has always been really, really cool. I mean, the weapon that I'm using in this clip literally has the brain of a dead dog. It's fucking awesome. Of course, we all know those huge, amazing, cool, big weapons. Things like the Fat Man that are just really, really detailed and interestingly styled, but then even down to just the smaller weapons. I went on a big rant earlier that you might remember about the Raider weapons, the sort of pipe rifles of Fallout 4, and even though I did say some other things like how I don't think the 10mm pistol look all that great, at the same time, at the end of the day, these weapons are just really, really outrageously styled, and I think that just works so well with how outrageously styled the games are. Although yes, you'll find many regular weapons in these games, your standard assault rifles, shotguns, and pistols, at the end of the day, the majority of the weapons are still really interestingly styled and very unique to the games themselves. A great example of this is just the melee weapons. There's just so many really, really interesting melee weapons that I think showcase how well styled these games are. And on top of that, there's just so many, and they basically give you a good reason to just play around with every single weapon that you get. So it feels like I'm constantly switching to this weapon and that weapon and just having a really good time, compared to many games where I feel like I usually stick with one or two weapons the entire playthrough. Even though sometimes that can happen, at the same time they do a really good job at really letting you experiment with the weapons. It also helps that a lot of the weapons basically just give a base rate of combat. What helps with this is the way that you sort of upgrade your weapons over time, because you actually really don't upgrade your weapons, you upgrade your character. This is something that has to do more with the systems of the game, but at the same time it's important to note that the way that the weapons work is that you have different perks like big guns, small guns, electrical guns, and based on how much skill points you put into those categories, your character will do more damage with different weapons. This just really encourages you to experiment with every single weapon that you get. Another really great thing about Fallout's combat is they just do a really good job at giving you really interesting encounters and really interesting enemies. Of course, the enemies and the enemy design falls more under sort of the deeper lore and the other things that these games set up. At the same time, I think it's important to note that for the most part, even though you are attacking a lot of humans, there's also some really, really cool monsters that you fight in the wasteland. And even though a lot of this can be generally applied to all of the 3D Fallout games, I think that New Vegas does the best with giving you different types of weapons, giving you different type of enemies to fight, and overall just a much better combat experience than Fallout 3, I'd say. And even though Fallout 4 is a much smoother game, Fallout New Vegas just does a great job with what it's given. Shooting, aiming down sights, everything feels how it should. Again, it's a little janky compared to modern games, but it works fine, and with VATS, for the most part it serves its duty. Oh, and finally I just want to say that melee combat really, really does suck in this game. That's something that I really can't contend with. Melee combat is just not that great. Anyways, continuing on, the VATS system is what picks up the scraps of the combat if you ask me. This was a sort of limb targeting system that was all the way in Fallout 1, but here it's basically an auto-aim system on cooldown. Go up to somebody, press the VATS button, and then give their head a good blastin'. It's pretty sweet, but as you can tell, I don't call Fallout New Vegas a 10 out of 10 for its gunplay, but for the way that your RPG character gets to interact with the enemies through combat. That sounds really stupid, but hear me out. Okay, so the VATS system was barely able to make the combat really engaging and fun, and for the most part, I feel like a majority of players just automatically target the heads and blast them off. But the really cool thing about combat is that the reason why this game can be amazing but still have mediocre combat is because of how the game treats it. Combat is not a core component of the experience unless the player makes it, and you often don't even need to engage in many fights and can work your way around them if you wish. A good portion of the game you're talking, negotiating, discovering, exploring, and doing something that very few games know how to do, which is give the player a very natural feeling experience in terms of how they engage with enemies. Natural as in it feels like a real world. Yes, this will always be a video game, but discovering quests and even completing said quests is usually completely open to the player. You could miss out on something and get a bad ending to a quest, and guess what? The game continues. Your actions will have consequences. Did you decide to make a funny robot the Sheriff of Primm?
Howdy, partner. Welcome to the Vicky and Vance Casino and Museum. Prim Slim at your service. Authentic cowpoke and official spokesspot of the Vicky and Vance Casino and Museum. Law enforcement protocols reinstated, partner. Initializing use of force authorization. Authorization found. Yeah!
Well, guess what? Literally, there's voice lines now around the entire game in which people will reference that you decided this outcome for this side quest. And also, it's a much better outcome than choosing a random person for some reason. I fucking love Prim Slim, bro. I love him. Anyways, as I've discussed in the last section, when you side with a faction, you really side with that faction. And all the other factions see you as that faction, and there's consequences. Other factions will shoot you on sight. People will be hostile to you because of who you choose to side with. You will get locked out of quests, and you will not see everything the world has to offer until literally your 4th playthrough. But simply there being an idea that there's still stuff to be done in the world, and there's still many replays for me to do, it gives me a sense of comfort. Dialogue is just, yeah, it's really good. I can't really describe it because when something's good, it's really hard to explain exactly why. The dialogue works well, it's never out of tone or pocket, it slips right into being believable, but allows you to put all sorts of interesting tricks inside of it.
Not even a little bit, no.
Okay, I'm talking about the dialogue and the gameplay structure and all of this in the combat section for one huge reason. Because unlike any other game, the combat in Fallout New Vegas is just another option to solve a problem. Just like combat is. Just like discovering things and lockpicking and your skill ability and finding your way through the world. Combat is just another tool in the huge sea of possibilities that you have in Fallout New Vegas. As easy as it is to shoot your way out of a problem, it's just as easy to speak your way out. This system of gameplay makes the tabletop RPG-esque perk and stat system that I'll talk about a little bit later work so much better. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the combat in Fallout New Vegas is just as good as the Fallout in Fallout 3. It's pretty mediocre. But what Fallout New Vegas does is it almost de-emphasizes combat. Not in the sense that it's not cool if you want it to be cool. You can still get big guns, you can still become a gun-toting fucking cowboy walking around the desert killing people, but it's just as easy to become a sly-talking gangster or a scientist in lockpick that can use tools to get your way out of any situation. It's really funny, this is my combat section of the video, but it's almost like a preamble to the whole systems talk that I'll be talking about in a bit. The combat is ass, but everything else about the game is amazing, and it somehow elevates the combat. Oh, and don't play on hardcore mode. You see, Fallout fans always want the Fallout games to play like Stalker. And to that, I say if you want to play the Stalker games, just play fucking Stalker. Those games hold up even better than Fallout at times. Fallout was and always will be about the story and contextualization that everything is sat in. Just like in the first part of this video where I talked about all the layers of immersion, the combat works so well because of all the other layers that are built on top of it and behind it. The combat is just a small minuscule part of this awesome world. And even though this is just a kind way of me saying that the fucking combat isn't that good in Fallout New Vegas, there's still so much to do, and it doesn't really hurt the game as much as I feel like a lot of people say it does. Anyways, here's a really quick side rant. The next part of this video is a really odd specific thing that I had in my head for the months that I was writing the script, and I never really found a really good place to shoehorn it in, so I guess I'll just talk about it here. You see, I think one of the most interesting ways that you can look at why Fallout New Vegas is so good is the way that they use raiders. What do I mean by this? Well, let me explain. Now, I know that every single game critic on YouTube has overused the term ludonarrative dissonance, but interestingly, an underutilized term is ludonarrative harmony. For instance, what's always used over and over again is Uncharted 4, and how in the story, Nathan Drake is a nice, good-hearted adventurer, yet in the gameplay, he's killing thousands of people. But ludonarrative harmony would be if the gameplay and the story matched up a lot better. For instance, a game where the story's about a serial killer, and you play as a brutal serial killer. Now, New Vegas has a really cool way of making this harmony happen. And although it sometimes makes the pacing of the game a bit sporadic, I think it works really well with the game as a whole. To describe this, I'm going to show something that Fallout 3 and 4 do really badly, but it's something that Fallout New Vegas fixes. Okay, so let me describe something that happens every few minutes in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4. You're passing through an area, killing the occasional ghoul or radroach. Ghouls and radroaches are very obvious threats, so of course you kill them when you see them. But then up there, boom, there's a random human that you don't know. What faction are they a part of? The game says that they're just raiders, which means they're bad guys in the middle of nowhere. So next thing you know, they're shooting at you, and of course, you have to kill them back. And so boom, there's a fun combat situation. Oh wow. But not only is this not really immersive, but it's in my opinion an example of ludonarrative dissonance. Who the hell are these people? Why are they here in the middle of nowhere? But whatever, because they're shooting at you, I guess I should shoot them back. Bethesda says that these are scary bad people that I must shoot. Okay, so now I know that many of you are gonna think that this is a nitpick, but in my opinion it really isn't. I'm role-playing to feel like I'm actually a part of a world, and when a game thinks it's okay to just throw random enemies at me because it's time to shoot, I guess, then I just instantly get kicked out of my immersion. And again, if it's an RPG, this practically ruins the whole point of the game, for me to be immersed in a world. Although it makes sense for radroaches and ghouls to randomly attack you, like they're just random enemies and zombies that are of course going to be hostile to you, a random human you stumble across in the world, why would they just, you know, instantly start shooting at me, a random person? If I have a set of rules for how I want to interact with a world, then the world should respect that. And essentially a good game would take your character and the specific rules and interactions that you've already had, and then throw that back at you and make your actions have actual consequences. The developers of New Vegas saw this happen in Fallout 3, and they decided to fix it. The solution was very, very simple, and it does a good job at actually rewarding the player for making their own experience. First of all, you almost never have a gunfight with other humans that aren't somehow connected to a different faction than your own. If you do enter a random gunfight, then it's against the Fiends, or the Powder Gangers, or some enemy group that has already been established. For instance, if you're an NCR person, then Legionaries will attack you, and if you're a Legionary, then the NCR will attack you. But Dashman, I hear you asking, what if you're nice to every single faction? Well, first of all, many factions, like again the Fiends and Powder Gangers, are initially very hostile to you. Even though the Legion and NCR both open up to you and somewhat accept you until you actually make, you know, a call on who you want to side with, there are a handful of factions that are of course naturally much more hostile to you. Just like how in the real world there's certain groups that are obviously not going to want to open up and accept you as much as others. For instance, the NPC in this clip and the clip before it are literally a part of the most violent, drug-toting faction that's in this game. Yet even to them, you have the option to talk to them and peacefully roam around their base. Only if you have a high enough speech stat, of course.
What the fuck are you doing here? You got some kind of fucking death wish, asshole? If you're fucking carrying, just fucking say so.
And the developers use this sort of natural idea of factions and allow it to make a system in which, although yes, you can be nice to many factions and open up to a lot of them, at the same time a lot of them will naturally be hostile to you. And even though for many of these you can turn onto their side, at least for a first playthrough, you'll also get a bunch of natural enemies. Secondly, the game does a good job at setting up these combat situations. Almost always, these small battles are usually because you come across some sort of side quest or you come across one of their outposts. Very few times you're met with just straight up combat in the middle of nowhere, just running across them in the middle of the desert. In fact, a lot of times there's some sort of dialogue or something else that's set up before the combat. You're talking to somebody and a natural outcome of that conversation is you and this person are gonna fight each other to death. And not to mention, having this sort of dialogue set up before many combat encounters allows for you to use your other skills. As I mentioned in the last section of the video, you have many tools to your disposal. You can learn to have a good speech stat or a good barter stat, or in some cases, things like a science skill can help you out. And anyways, that means that if you have a specific skill, sometimes you can just talk your way out of combat. For instance, the last few clips have been from a side quest in which you have to sort of negotiate a hostage situation. And even though this can end in combat, of course another option is to simply negotiate your way out of it. The combat is another route of the puzzle, not just a guaranteed outcome.
I can't believe I'm doing this. But alright, the hostages can go. The NCR had better keep their end of the deal, though.
As much as I can analyze how amazing the lack of OMG random raider attacks and kills you, uwu, I have to say that overall, it just makes the game feel real. In a real life scenario, you do everything you can before having a fight with somebody. If you're in the street and somebody comes up to you and wants to fight, you're gonna try to talk to them before, you actually fight them. There's gonna be a reason why they personally want to fight you before, you guys actually start duking it out. The game doesn't feel like a game, it feels like an interactive experience experience, a fucking RPG. At the base, that's what Fallout has always been, and it's shocking that Bethesda doesn't even try to set it up so that there's a solid reason for you to be killing just random groups of people. In fact, without the intense stories and dialogue, the act of killing people simultaneously becomes a worthless act. The reason why shooting people feels so interesting in this game is because you have the option to talk to so many other people. The most intense RPGs have been those with strong themes around death and killing and the meaning of being a human being. And when Bethesda slaps around death and combat like it's nothing, it makes it impossible to have these themes on any bit of a deeper level. That's why the whole synth storyline was likely chosen for Fallout 4. It's a way for us to ask about what makes us human without actually caring about the other humans in the story. How about you use factions and humans to critique humanity? But instead they literally couldn't. It's almost like the synth characters were put in specifically to be like really non-human so that the non-human human characters would feel more human than they usually are. The people in Fallout New Vegas though, they feel like actual humans. They feel like they have actual motives and means to be who they are. And most importantly, the game allows you to interact with them like that's the case, like they are humans. And that's why I think in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, random raiders just fucking suck. It's this random group of, here's an outpost in the middle of nowhere, a group of, I don't know, 5 to 10 people. You see them and they kill you, and fucking dude, okay. So anyways, now that this section's over, I think this is a great place to transfer into talking about the RPG elements of this game. All the statistics and small underlying RPG elements that make Fallout New Vegas very unique in those aspects. So in the last segment, I basically covered the many ways that the RPG side of Fallout New Vegas allows for players to have complex solutions and interactions within the game world itself. But for a bit now, I want to discuss those number-crunching, character-creating RPG elements on their own and a little more in depth. Okay, RPGs are amazing, and one of the most important components of RPGs, in my opinion, is really making the world feel real, and giving the characters options to be whatever type of character they want. I think I've already done a good job at describing how the game does that with the story and the world itself, because there's so many branching paths, objectives, and things inside the world where the player is very barely forced to make decisions and options and go down quest lines that they don't want to. Hell, in terms of structure, if the player is really good at the game, they can beat the main story in just a few hours if they're smart enough. But anyways, in this section of the video, I'm going to be going in depth into all of the many systems of the game that allow for this sort of creative freedom. Basically, I'm boiling down everything the game gives you, such as the statistics of the character that you're playing as, the customization of your own weapons and those stats, and also systems such as the economy of the game. But anyways, of course, we're going to start off by looking at the stats. At the start of every Fallout game, you can choose all sorts of statistics. There's special perks and fun special stats for you to have for the rest of the game. Even though you get to upgrade your character increasingly over the entire game, it should be noted that at the very start, the starting perks and choices do matter a lot. I said at the start of this video to try not to make yourself a jack of all trades, and unlike any other Fallout game I've played, Fallout New Vegas truly makes the player play through the game a number of times before they truly have completed almost everything. And so don't feel bad if you leave some skills and abilities behind, because honestly, it's so worth it having to revisit them and really experience different characters on different playthroughs, instead of ramming everything and every stat into one playthrough alone. A master of trades is a master of none. By the way, the full quote goes against that, so don't take it as life advice. Anyways, there's nothing cooler than being a special mercenary with a completely unique skill set, or a smooth-talking gangster that can get his way in and out of any casino. The special skills as well make it so that your journey is really unique and interesting. Hell, I once skipped a literal 2-hour questline by choosing a perk that made my character gay. Yo.
Just seem really understanding. The guy you're looking for, Benny, he was traveling with some members from my old gang.
Oh my gosh.
They were going.
Okay, so here is a quest at the REPCON facility, where you have to go here and it's for real an hour-long quest that you have to do, but because I seduced him, I skipped it. That's so fucking funny. Of course, this perk would work on a woman and just make her straight, but my character, of course, that I chose was a man, and so the perk made him gay. On my second playthrough, when I found this out, I was completely bewildered because I literally skipped like an hour or two quest line by choosing this perk. And now, basically on every subsequent playthrough, I'm gonna make my character gay just because that stupid quest line is something I'm definitely fine with skipping. Some of the perks as well, like this one that let me see every single location that I hadn't visited yet, were really great, especially if you're doing the Sunset Sarsaparilla questline like me, where I spent many actual hours scouring the wasteland for special bottle caps. And getting the special treasure at the end of this questline was so satisfying. And then of course the special perks like the Wild Wasteland perk that basically add a bunch of really random and crazy events into your game means that it's really easy to make your new playthrough different than your last. And it's really what I think sets New Vegas apart in terms of replays other than the many branches of the main story. Because of course there's many different storylines that you can experience, but also in terms of the special stat part of the game, there's also so many different things you can experience. By the end of my first playthrough, I'd basically maxed out every base stat, but that's because all the DLC and all of that gives you so much XP. And even though my character was really buffed, it didn't mean that the DLC was easy. In fact, the DLC was still really hard. Okay, so anyways, next system. Let's talk about skill checks, which are sort of a part of the skill system. Skill checks in every other game like Fallout 3 or Fallout 4 are basically a roll of dice.
Whoa, easy there, Vault Girl. This stuff.
You stop waving that gun in my...
Okay, just take it easy.
If you want to convince somebody with a specific skill in a specific dialogue segment, the chances of being able to use that skill in that dialogue segment is based off of how high that specific stat is. For instance, if you want to convince somebody that you're good at using explosives, if you have a higher statistic for explosives, it'll be easier to convince them and get that specific dialogue option and succeed. But at the same time, this is just a roll of the dice. This means that you can be almost terrible at a skill, but very easily use safe cucking to repeat the skill check until you win and get the special outcome that you're trying to get. This is just terrible, and it rewards absolutely nobody at all. Also, if you put a lot of effort into one specific skill, somebody who didn't put all that much time and XP into that skill can basically get through the skill check without any of the work. This type of RNG manipulation is terrible and should basically only be saved for like stupid speedrun strats. But now you see New Vegas does it very differently. You see, it's just a yes or no if you get the skill check based on the skills that you actually have.
So you're planning on taking on Joe Cobb's gang? I was planning on sitting this one out, but for some reason, I can't help but like you.
The game shows you how close or far away you are from passing the skill check, so if you really want to, you can upgrade a skill and eventually have enough to pass. Also, of course, the number of skill points you need for each check is very different, which of course makes sense because it should be easier to convince a random person on the street of your medical experience than, let's say, an actual doctor. It feels like time was actually put in to make the experience dynamic to who you are as a character. And also, the outcome of these skill checks actually do change the story in the ways that you interact with it. I can't think of a single time that a skill check really influenced how I played Fallout 4, with the biggest reward usually just being money.
Get rid of Wolfgang. Wolfgang and I had a deal, okay? I'll make it 125 caps.
But in New Vegas, those were really the highlights of many of my sessions, as I felt like I had actually earned the right to do something cool. I wasn't just sitting down and pressing through random dialogue options for no reason. For people who still defend Fallout 3 and 4's skill checks though, I understand that traditional tabletop RPGs, the games that inspired the original Fallout games, games like D&D, do have skill checks that are based on random chance. For instance, you're often rolling dice to see if you're able to achieve the specific option. But just generally, I think that this random dice system is really bad for video games, particularly because of how direct the skill are to the player. There's never really an accuracy check in these games, because the accuracy of whether you shoot somebody with your gun is literally based on your real life accuracy with your mouse or with your controller. And so the change of making skill checks a literal yes or no in Fallout New Vegas is great, because it bypasses the sort of random chance that you can just save and reload around.
Too dangerous. Gonna kill all yourselves. Too dangerous.
even though I and many other people don't think that save cucking to achieve the solution you want is right, at the end of the day, when it's right in front of you and it's just a matter of pressing a single button, it's really hard to not abuse saves if it's right there in front of you. And the feeling of failing a skill check just because, I don't know, the game randomly said that you have to, feels absolutely cheap, and unlike in D&D, where you see the actual dice roll and understand the exact odds of something happening, in games it feels a lot more random, and thus a lot more unfair, and is why the skill checks in Fallout New Vegas are possibly the best in the series. Okay, so the next system I'll talk about is affiliation. So every single faction in the game, big or small, has their own affiliation meter. This meter basically showing whether they like you, don't like you, or anything in between. Whether you like it or not, you're always directly or indirectly causing this meter for many factions to go up and down at a given time. The results span from not mattering at all to literally changing the outcome of the game, so be careful. I had a friend that was going for a specific ending of the game and didn't realize how truly complex the affiliation system was. For instance, he wanted a specific armor set that's given out at a specific affiliation level with the NCR. But little did he know, he had to do a lot more to be affiliated with the NCR as closely as he wanted to. And so he basically had to do quests for them until it felt like he was literally a soldier working under them. I think affiliation is really cool just because it boosts the immersion of different playthroughs of the game. Even though you don't really need the meter to have the affiliation system, it's really nice to know exactly where you lie in the world. And it's really cool to know just on a second's glance whether or not your actions actually do have consequences, and how interactive the world of Fallout New Vegas really is. Anyways, that was a short one. The next system is the economy. My favorite part of the New Vegas economy is specifically how it's implemented throughout the pacing of the game, specifically with the opening sections of your first playthrough. You see, I traveled through the Mojave doing a bunch of odd jobs and making my way eventually to the Strip. And then you reach Freeside, the big town alongside the Strip, and as I mentioned, you go up to the Strip and you need 2,000 bottle caps to actually enter.
Admission to the Strip requires an official passport or proof that you are carrying the required minimum balance. These policies prevent less reputable persons from entering. I'm sorry, but your balance does not meet the minimum balance.
Even though a pro player could likely get this number in less than 15 minutes, most starting players don't know those special cap locations and really good ways to get caps fast, and thus a majority of players have to do a bunch of jobs, and the best jobs are all around Freeside outside of the Strip. This seems so menial, but they're literally using the economy of the game to set up a barrier which makes the player feel like they have to actually explore a town and do jobs, which in turn helps you get a better feeling for the Strip and the game itself. After a bit of questing, you finally have enough caps and can enter the Strip. And oh boy, is it so satisfying when you get enough caps and you can finally enter. The Strip then opens up gambling and the main storylines that I explained earlier, and overall is one of the highlights of this game itself. Caps are just really valuable in this game, and they do a good job at making it feel like the number that you have in your pocket legitimately matters a ton in terms of your standing in the world. And just generally, I think especially in the starting parts of the game, they do a great job at using the caps, using the economy to sort of pace the game and make you have to go through it a bit slowly, where I feel like a lot of players would rush to the conclusion. They're able to use this natural barrier to get you off. For instance, so many games nowadays, like let's say the Assassin's Creed games or The Witcher, whether or not you have enough skill to do a mission, they literally show you, the required amount of levels or the required amount of XP that you need. But in Fallout New Vegas, they have the economy gate that off for you. It's so fucking smart and it's so cool, and I really wish games nowadays were smart enough to do this. Anyways, as you play more and more, you get more experience and you also get more guns. And let me just say, there's both so many different guns, and the gun system in this game is just really good as well. There's so many different guns, there's so many different ammo types, there's so many different this and that. It's a lot to keep up with at first, but eventually you realize that this really just means you need to incentivize your loadout even more. There's so many good guns in the game that the problem by the end of your playthrough isn't trying to find them, but figuring out which ones are worth keeping and using. Also, keeping track of ammo and going around to buy or make sure you have enough is really important and is really fun to do, especially in the lower parts of the game. I know that I've described that the combat isn't amazing, but let me just tell you and confirm that everything around the combat, like the gun system, is really cool. One problem a lot of my friends have is the repair system in this game. You see, repairing a broken weapon costs a lot of caps, but the insanely cheap way of fixing them is by finding the same weapon around the Mojave and using that to combine them and make a gun that has a much higher durability. I think this system is really cool because it's sort of like, of course if you find a similar gun, you could use that to fix your own. And so of course the more common guns will definitely be able to have a much higher durability. And then the guns that are much more rare, it'll obviously be a lot harder to find other guns like that to help repair them. Even though it's just another system, it's also pretty realistic when you come to think about it. And which is why, even though I think a lot of people don't like this system, I still defend it. So anyways, that's a bunch of different systems of the game, from the stats to the guns to the economy, and I hope I did a good job at sort of explaining them and why Fallout New Vegas does them better than many other games and many other Fallout games. But I know what you guys have been waiting for. You're waiting for me to really get to the main point of this video, what the point of Fallout New Vegas is. And through the DLC, I think you'll come to realize that Fallout has a lot more to say than what meets the eye. So let's get into the DLC. Fallout New Vegas took a solid 80 hours for me to complete on my first playthrough. I did almost all the side quests, I went through the NCR main quest line, and I completed all the DLC. The first reason why this DLC is covered separately in this video is because the DLC took a total of 40 hours, half of my entire playthrough, to complete, and thus it definitely deserves to be analyzed on its own. Secondly, each one of the 4 main DLC is its own separate map with its own separate main quest line. And lastly, I'm deciding to cover the DLC like this because it does a really good job at doing exactly what DLC should do. It adds on top of what's already in the game, but more importantly, it adds onto the main themes and onto the meaning of the game. Again, the conclusion of this video is me describing what I think the purpose of New Vegas is, what the developers were trying to say with its gameplay and its story. But I also think it's important to talk about the DLC because it's really integral to getting to that point. Part of that reason is also because there's a sort of secret subtext underneath all the DLC in which you could sort of follow the main path of this small little story going underneath every single one of the 4 DLC packs. It connects them all together. Also, the DLC is really good, so I'm gonna talk about it. So before I started the DLC, I googled the best order to play them in, and I decided that the order of Honest Hearts, Dead Money, Old World Blues, and then finally Lonesome Road was probably the best order to play them in. Even though you can probably switch up Dead Money and Old World Blues, this is still the order that I'd recommend that you play them in. So anyways, let's start off with the first DLC, Honest Hearts. Honest Hearts is a pretty good DLC overall. So it starts off with you taking a trip with an expedition group through the Zion Canyons. Of course, just like everything else in Fallout New Vegas, this is a real-life place. But then as you're traveling through, things go wrong, and a sort of native tribe kills everybody, and you're the only one left alive.
Shh. Hold on now. God damn it, ambush! Cover people! Watch yourselves!
This is really funny because it's sort of like in the intro they're setting up these characters and then they just all die instantly. It's honestly pretty funny. So basically in this canyon there's 3 main indigenous tribes that are sort of the ancestors of people that of course lived past the nuclear bombs. The 3 tribes are the White Legs, who are the evil guys who almost killed you at the start of the game, and then the 2 other are non-evil tribes. There's the Sorrows and the Dead Horses. And then each one of the non-evil tribes is actually ran by somebody who isn't indigenous to this area. It's ran by a New Canaanite. The Dead Horses are led by Joshua Graham, who I briefly mentioned earlier. And Daniel, yet another character with a sort of biblical reference name, is the leader of the Sorrows. Now the main conflict in this entire DLC is that Joshua Graham wants to fight with his tribe, the Dead Horses, alongside Daniel's tribe, the Sorrows, to take down the vicious White Legs. But the motives and backgrounds of all of the main characters is where all the themes and importance comes from this DLC. The tribes in this DLC that are good, the Sorrows and Dead Horses, are honestly pretty unimportant in terms of their contribution contribution to the themes of the story, because they're basically just being commanded by these two guys with really set ideologies. The White Horses, on the other hand, have an actually really interesting reason to be doing all of this terrible stuff to you. You see, they believe that if they conquer enough other tribes and are able to build a big enough army, then Caesar and Caesar's legion will take them under their wing. That's why they're trying to kill or drive out the other tribes in Zion. It's to show Caesar that they have worth. The final two big pieces of the puzzle are Daniel and Joshua. Joshua was a leader in Caesar's army. He was a part of Caesar's legion and became one of their biggest warriors. In fact, in the very conclusion of the main story of Fallout New Vegas, you fight against who is essentially Joshua Graham's replacement. Okay, so a long time ago, the NCR and Caesar's legion were of course still fighting over the Hoover Dam, and in a really old battle, Caesar's legion lost, and Joshua was of course the main leader of that attack. Having lost the battle, Caesar is incredibly disappointed in him, and Caesar shows off his strength and its disappointment by burning Joshua and throwing him away.
Caesar had to make an example for the others, to show them that even at the highest level, failure wouldn't be tolerated. He had Graham covered in pitch, lit on fire, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. People say he didn't even scream on the way down.
Somehow, surviving, Joshua made it his purpose to protect the Dead Horse tribe, and in fighting with his new tribe against the Whitelegs, he is essentially fighting back against Caesar's legion, who burned and almost killed him so long ago. Because the Whitelegs are trying to get Caesar's attention, in fighting them, again, it's sort of, in a way, fighting against the ideologies of the man that almost killed him. Daniel also believes in protecting his tribe, the Sorrows, against the Whitelegs, but unlike Joshua, he thinks that it's his duty to play the pacifist role. All these tribes are indigenous and pretty stupid, and he thinks that leading the Sorrows out of Zion is really important because it prevents a war between these tribes. Now, the final decision of the DLC is basically whether you help out Daniel with his pacifist route, or you help out Joshua in his more violent one. The Daniel ending is typically viewed as the lesser one though, because you basically cave down and let the Whitelegs, and thus Caesar, take control of the valley. And then Joshua's ending is honestly pretty good, and it of course is because Joshua in general is just awesome as hell. He easily became one of the most popular and coolest characters in the entire game series, and that's for obvious reasons. He has a cold-spoken demeanor, and despite being burned alive, is still able to cling to his morals and ideologies without going over the deep end. He's calm and collected, he shows restraint, and again is just one of the best characters in the entire Fallout series, especially because of how easily orchestrated this all is to the player. Okay, so overall this DLC is honestly probably the easiest DLC, and I'd say is pretty decent. The story is good, the characters are even better, but my biggest criticism is that unlike literally every other group and people in the game, those indigenous tribes in Zion are just really annoying to interact with. Joshua and Daniel are really fun to talk to, but all of the other characters that aren't Daniel or Joshua, they're just these uncivilized indigenous tribe people. Like, I get the point, they don't know anything about the outside world, but honestly, this sort of dynamic gets really boring really fast. This sort of being left out of the knowledge of the outside world is reused again in a later DLC, and it leads to one of the funniest things and funniest moments in the entire Fallout series in my opinion. But here, it's not really done that much for comedy, it's just annoying. It's basically a majority of the talking in this DLC. Trying to talk to these people is the worst. It's like having to discuss politics with a kindergartner at a big fancy party where you can see all the interesting people to the side that you really want to talk to, but yeah, honestly, I'd rather die than discuss Banana Yucca with Pippi the Gardener again.
You might try luring the baby out with some banana yucca.
Okay, so the main point and theme of this DLC is to see how outreached Caesar's influence has grown. Even though he hasn't conquered this area, the knowledge of him and the influence of him has infected a lot of other people. Also, there's a really heavy influence on biblical themes, something that Fallout New Vegas honestly does a lot more than you'd think. You see, these men are essentially leading a tribe of people to salvation, and it's really interesting and tied with the rest of what's supplied in the other DLC packs. It helps expand the knowledge of the greater area around the Mojave Desert. It's interesting to see these men fight for their beliefs, almost through the tribes that they're controlling. And we get another great brain exercise in which I feel like a good majority of people are really able to see how important it is to stand up for your beliefs and not run away when confronted with an oppressive force. So yeah, it's a really good DLC pack. But anyways, let's move on to the next one. Dead Money DLC is likely my least favorite of the bunch, but really only because of the gunplay, which gets a bit monotonous near the end. But as I described earlier, this is sort of the case with all of New Vegas, so it doesn't really stand out in particular in this DLC. That being said, even though it's my least favorite of the bunch, it still is amazing for the same reasons why all the other DLC packs are amazing. It has a great main story and it has amazing characters. So the story consists of you basically being held hostage with an exploding neck collar around your neck by this weird ex-Brotherhood guy named Elijah.
Play stupid, play clever. Make the mistake of saying no. That collar on your neck will go off and take your head with it.
And he's forcing you to sort of do a heist on this pre-war casino with a bunch of other people that he's kidnapped. And these other characters are all really, really interesting. Just from this, you can likely see that the story is really unique, just like everything else in New Vegas. And honestly, the location of this DLC pack is such a highlight. This location, despite being sort of desolate and scary, it's also just absolutely beautiful. And unlike almost every single location in the Fallout series and in this game, the casino is almost completely preserved, mostly with its pre-war glory. Of course, many parts of it are desolate and broken. Many other parts are also just as beautiful as it would have been from before the bombs dropped. As you venture through the casino, you both have a great story with all of the side characters, but you also find out the lore of the casino as a whole, and sort of all of the dark secrets and deeds that went on behind the scenes. And then also, one big highlight of this chapter, just like all the other DLC packs for New Vegas, are the characters that you interact with. Specifically, again, the characters that you're also imprisoned with, the other ones with neck collars that help you with this heist, they are just phenomenal. You see, there's 3 side characters that help you out, and each character is very, very, very unique. Specifically, I feel like the game developers decided to see all the interesting ways that you can interact with them. So the characters consist of this old ghoul entertainer named Dean Domino, and he was a famous singer from before the war. Then there's also this super mutant that has split personalities. One is a very stupid and obeying personality. That one's named Dog, and then the other personality is the reversed version. They're very smart and free thinking, and their name is God. Finally, there's Christine, who literally cannot speak to you because her voice box was mutilated in a machine. Dean Domino is sassy as hell.
Get up without my permission. I'll blast your ass so far through your head, it'll turn the moon cherry pie red.
And because he's a ghoul and he was here from before the bombs dropped, he has a lot of interesting insight into the casino and the background of it. The split personality of Dog and God, you interact with each one of them differently, and most importantly, to reach the other split personality, you have to play a holotape.
I've watched over Dog for so long. He doesn't understand. He has the brain of a child. He's my brother, kin. I just need him to show restraint.
Are you listening?
Remember you. Dog hears many voices. One in air. The other one.
This means that you have really interesting conversations in which you're flipping from one of them to the next, having a sort of separated conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, Christine literally cannot speak. And so the subtitles, which would usually be the speech of the person talking to you, are actually describing the movements that she's making, the gestures. And thus you basically have a conversation with this person through their body movement. The text literally displays the physical actions she's doing. It's really, really, really fun. This small aspect of Christine is honestly one of my favorite parts of this entire DLC. It was so much fun to sort of try to decipher what she's trying to tell you. Anyways, as you continue with this sort of heist along this long-lost casino, you need to take precautions in how you interact with each person to make sure that they're doing just what you want. I can't tell you how cool it was to solve these sort of puzzles by interpreting what Christine was trying to say, or by switching between Dog and God, and having them come to some sort of agreement with each other. It's all done very, very well. As I mentioned earlier, the combat gets stale really fast, and other than a few mechanics and things to try to interact with, the world itself is pretty boring. You're given new weapons similar to all the other DLCs, but as I mentioned earlier, the combat gets pretty monotonous after a while. Okay, so the main sort of antagonist, of course, is Father Elijah, who's forcing you and all the other enslaved characters to get into the vault of the Sierra Madre Hotel. Inside the vault, there's tons of gold bars for you to steal, yet it's interestingly conveyed to you that you can't carry all of them and get back to the Mojave alive, even though a lot of people are still able to do it. Every single DLC, by the way, has 2 endings that you can reach, and the 2 in this DLC are whether you kill Father Elijah or you trap him in the vault by sneaking out behind him, which is pretty neat. Overall, I think the coolest part of this DLC are of course the creative ways that you interact with the characters. Elijah, being an ex-Brotherhood of Steel member as well, helps solidify the Brotherhood of Steel's presence in the Mojave and Fallout New Vegas, and the fact that the Sierra Madre Hotel is still sort of kept in its pre-war beauty really explains why Father Elijah is so drawn to it. You see, he's an ex-Brotherhood of Steel member, but he still sort of has that mindset to preserve and study this technology. Christine is actually important in a later part of the DLCs, and then again, the two other characters, Dean Domino and Dog and God, are just really cool. Where the last DLC really helped straighten out Caesar's Legion as a faction in the story, this one really strengthens the Brotherhood of Steel faction, specifically again with how their need for power can ultimately corrupt people and lead to their downfall. Similarly, the casino itself, similar to many of the other casinos in this game, shows off the lengths that places were willing to go before the bombs dropped in order to push their greedy ways. It's untouched, and more than almost any part of the entire Fallout franchise, you directly see the faults of the past and the greed that honestly did lead to the war itself. This DLC pack is very morbid, and it really reminds you about how many people must have died before humanity crawled out of its ashes. And this is one of the only parts of the Fallout series, other than the original games or the opening of Fallout 4, that has done this. Definitely give this one a go. Dead Money is a really solid addition to the DLC, despite being a bit scrappy at times in terms of its main gameplay, but overall I think that the characters and the way that you interact with them is really a highlight of this DLC. Really good job, you guys should play it. Anyways, let's move on to the next one, and my favorite of the DLC packs, Old World Blues. In the first part of this video, I briefly mentioned how Fallout uses comedy very well, and how the comedy in this series is only done so well because there's a bunch of lore and setup that is solid enough for them to build a really good joke on top of it. The DLC pack Old World Blues is by far the funniest segment of the entire Fallout universe that I've played, in my opinion, and this is one of the only cases where the game goes really far out of its way to be crazy and insane, and it actually works really well within the world and for the comedy. It does break a few rules that I previously said the game should have. For instance, if you remember, I criticized a joke about this baseball guy not understanding what baseball was. But because this game is DLC, and it's set up to be somewhat separate from the rest of the game, the silly nature honestly works a lot better, and it really achieves this type of comedy that's attempted but not really achieved at other parts of the game. Okay, so at the very start of Old World Blues, you're teleported by a device you find in the overworld, and awaken in a weird facility overlooking this crazy looking area. You wake up in a gown and you feel a bit odd, and you notice that you're not only in a nightgown, but you have scars all along your body. You go downstairs from your room and you see these guys, the Think Tank. Wow, how odd and mysterious. I wonder if they're really scary or serious or mystical.
Be warned, intruder! You are in the presence of a mighty think tank of Big Mountain, the collective geniuses of... By Oppenheimer, which one of you self-professed geniuses has been adjusting my volume knob? Who was it?
Nope, these guys are basically just a bunch of silly, wacky characters that have almost no understanding of what an actual human is like.
Did it just say something? Anyone catch that? Boros, you work with animals. Translate.
Okay, so in my recording of this DLC pack, this single starting conversation at the start of this DLC takes literally an entire hour. It's literally the longest dialogue sequence I had with anyone throughout the entire game. And it's not like I was forced to stay there the entire time, but somehow I was really interested in what these guys were all about. And even though it might sound really annoying to have this really long conversation, it works really well. There's running jokes, like one of them saying that the toes on your feet look like little dicks.
Are those penises I see wriggling on its feet? Disgusting.
And just overall, each one of these guys has their own individual quirk or weird thing that pops up over and over again.
Why, my little bear of teddiness?
I was at the top of my high school class in American high school. We would know if our research was flawed.
And their leader, Dr. Klein, is just such a captivating person to talk to.
It's a lobotomite, here, in the dome.
Also, just in general, the voice acting in this segment is absolutely amazing. I mean, listen to this voice work.
Oh, as if this situation couldn't get any worse. Now we've got lobotomites!
Anyways, it turns out that you basically had your brain taken out of your body. By who? By this other evil floating head dude named Dr. Mobius.
It is I, Dr. Mobius. My deadly robo-scorpions swarm across Big Mountain with their pincers and pointy laser tails.
And you're tasked with getting back your own brain. Anyways, in turn, you learn more about the think tank and all the weird events that happened at Big Mountain. Yes, this place is literally called Big Mountain. Big Mountain is essentially an old government science facility where the scientists were preserved like this in a really weird form after the bombs dropped. For what reason? Well, of course, so they can just continue their science experiments and whatnot.
The hopes and dreams of a century became realities in the electronic forges of Big Mountain, where no problem could not be solved, where no question could not be answered. On the night of October 23rd, 2077, the scientists received an answer that put all their questions to rest. In the aftermath, Big Mountain's silent experiments went to sleep.
So anyways, this place is of course really wacky. These people having no understanding of what a human is. It's just extremely uninhabitable for humans, and it's really fun to make your way around and sort of interact with this weird world that is floating off in the middle of nowhere. So of course, after doing a few tasks for the main think tank, you finally meet Dr. Mobius, and you get the big twist of what's really happening at Big Mountain. You see, Dr. Mobius is actually the one in complete control of the think tank. And it turns out the think tank, the people you were talking to for literally an hour at the beginning of the DLC, despite calling you a lobotomite, they themselves are all lobotomized. So essentially, Dr. Mobius is playing this game in which he acts like a big villain because it's entertaining for them to have, you know, a big person to battle with, and it's entertaining for him to be against the think tank. Also, it's not so subtly mentioned that Dr. Mobius, the fucking bad guy, is just addicted to crack or something.
So many such varieties. Whenever I take Mentats, I can feel my entire chassis breathe like a big spherical lung.
So essentially the whole plot of this DLC is you're following and listening to lobotomized, crackhead floating brains so that you can get back your own brain, and This is by far my favorite DLC. Anyways, like all the other DLCs, there's two main endings, but for the most part, things don't really sway that far from here. You ultimately have a conversation with your own brain. Yes, you talk to your own brain who has a British accent.
Well, that's a fine how do you do. Me, quote, Dick, unquote.
And essentially you have to convince him to get back into your body. How have you been able to survive without a brain for so long, by the way? Well, he's actually hooked up to something in your head that lets you live. So in this weird turn of fate, you're convincing your own brain to get back into your body. Again, it's complete fucking absurdism, but it works so well. Overall, if you can't tell already, I really did enjoy this DLC pack more than any of the others. Just like all the other DLCs, there's pretty big connections between this DLC pack and the sort of ultimate storyline that's going on with all of the other DLCs. And we'll talk about that when we conclude with the next DLC pack. But more than all the other DLCs, this one really just lets you have fun. I think that it has the best special weapons, for instance that dog brain gun that I mentioned earlier, and it isn't scared at all to get a bit silly. I'm not saying that I wish Fallout was completely silly, by the way. I mean, as I've mentioned earlier, there's many times in which this sort of absurdism, oh my god, I don't know what the past was like, gets a bit annoying at time, but the thing with Old World Blues is that the entire DLC was just based around this principle and this sort of just funny situation. The characters are absolutely absurd, but just like all the other DLC packs, they're really deep and you can talk to them for such a long period of time. In the setting, there's many areas that connect to some of the main characters, and in doing so, you learn more about them. And even though I'm not going to go in depth into every single character like I did in the last DLC, I think that this sort of small quirks that each one of them had was just built very well. It's a great location, it has great characters, and it has a really great story. Anyways, to tie this DLC key back into sort of the main point of the first part of this video, the humor works so well in this part of the DLC because you sort of have that deeper lore that sets up everything that's going on. And even though sometimes many of the other games get this right, I think more than any other part of the Fallout universe, they do a really good job at just building on top of things, building on top of layers of jokes and just plot points and lore. They take everything that is known about Fallout and they twist it in a way in which there's able to be this really fantastical place. And just legitimately, I think this is one of the best examples of why I like Fallout to begin with. And there's nothing else I can say other than I'm very impressed by the writers of this DLC. I legitimately laughed more playing this DLC than any other part of the Fallout series, actually more than almost any other video game I've ever played, period. And now it's finally time for the conclusion of this DLC. Let's talk about the final DLC pack, Lonesome Road. Hi, so this is probably going to be the last time that you see me before the very end of this video, and I'm just coming in here really quickly to explain how important the next segment is. I kind of tried my best to put emphasis on the last DLC pack, but as you can tell by the length of this segment of the video compared to all the other DLCs, I don't only talk about the final DLC pack, but it's a good conclusion of all of the DLC packs. And then this segment really quickly flows into me talking about what I think the main message is of Fallout New Vegas. So anyways, yeah, I'm only adding this here so that you understand the really big importance of this next segment, even though it is just another discussion of a DLC pack. Anyways, let's get right into it. Lonesome Road is the big conclusion of all of the DLC packs, and technically, in my opinion, it's also the really big climax of the entirety of Fallout New Vegas itself. Other than the Hoover Dam battle, which marks the actual end of the game, I think that Lonesome Road is at least the thematic climax of the game. This is partially because it has some of the hardest areas, some of the most annoying enemies, and generally requires the highest amount of skill over any other part of the game. Not to mention, it ties the entire message of the DLCs into one nice neat bow, but also the entire message of Fallout New Vegas into one nice neat package. And because of that, even though this segment is a discussion about the last DLC pack, it's also going to be a sort of conclusion about the entire story of Fallout New Vegas. Despite the importance of this DLC pack though, the experience of this pack is pretty lonesome. Quite honestly, going in, I was expecting a lot of the charm that all the other DLCs had, with a lineup of interesting characters, each one of them unique and having their own charm. But just like the name of this DLC suggests, you're pretty much alone throughout a lot of this DLC, with the main purpose being you trying to reach the end and finally meeting the mysterious character Ulysses. Ulysses as a character ties all the DLCs together and also the entire narrative of Fallout New Vegas together. And most importantly, he drives forward the point of the game to begin with. There's a companion named Eddie, who you meet in the base game, and he's basically your only companion and company for the entirety of this DLC. And other than a small and pretty insubstantial side story with him, you're pretty much alone through this DLC, and forced to go through the linear trials of this valley alone. Okay, so because of the sort of focus on gameplay in this segment of the game, I feel the need to talk about it in a more substantial way than any of the other DLC packs. The gunplay, just like all the other DLCs, is just like the gunplay that I expressed in the combat and gameplay segment of this video. But at this point of the game, you'll likely be overpowered as fuck, so you're probably very capable of tearing apart multiple Deathclaws at once. That being said, they still make me shit my pants every single time I see them coming. Also, these tunneler enemies are probably my least favorite in this entire game other than maybe Cazadors. My problem with them is that they look very, very weak, but they hit like an absolute truck, and even worse, they tank a lot of damage. But as long as you have a shotgun to shoot these guys in the face with, you'll probably be fine. You see, this DLC pack has a lot of gameplay and sort of gimmicks, yet at the same time, it's probably the most linear of any of the DLCs. There's just a straight path that you're basically following from start to finish, down this long and winding valley. You occasionally talk to Ulysses through Eddie's radio, but for the most part, once again, you're alone, and you're really forced to use all of your abilities, all of the things that you have in your arsenal, to make it through this really desolate area. So anyways, this DLC pack as a whole is pretty basic until you get to the end, and then you finally meet him, Ulysses. And now, I think I'm gonna spend a bit of time to explain his story, and explain why he's the most important character to understand and to truly get the meaning behind Fallout New Vegas. A lot of his background isn't directly told to the player, and through a lot of sort of small things found throughout the world, people have pieced together what Ulysses' story is. So anyways, here's a description of Ulysses.
If my life burns out here, so be it. Until then, I wait and watch, see what the road brings.
The simplest description of Ulysses is that he's a centrist, but to reach that point, you need to understand who Ulysses is and how he came to think what he thinks. The big connection between all of these DLCs is that Ulysses has been to all of these places, and also he's met many of these characters that you have. His background is that he was in a tribe. His tribe was sort of similar to the tribes of Honest Hearts, and his tribe was ultimately taken in by Caesar's Legion, and he became one of Caesar's great warriors, similar to Joshua Graham. Despite this, he always kept his symbolic curls in his hair that signify that original tribe he was a part of. So in some of his undercover work for Caesar's Legion, he discovers the Divide. This is the main area that you travel through in Lonesome Road. But most importantly, he discovers it before it was ravaged by war. Yes, this place looks really nuked, but this wasn't from the great dropping of the bombs that was the catalyst for the Fallout series. No, this place was bombed very recently, and actually bombed by a war between Caesar's Legion and the NCR. But in this area, he saw a prospering community that rose in this land. It connected the East and the West, and in his eyes, this community, before its demise, would have had the potential to become one of the most prosperous and true nations he had ever seen. Yet, once the NCR and Caesar's Legion found out about this place, they fought over it, resulting in the NCR getting a courier to bring a piece of technology to the Divide. And inadvertently, this technology makes all the unlaunched nukes in the Divide go off, destroying it, and leaving behind rubble, making the land uninhabitable by humans, and turning the NCR and Caesar's Legion soldiers that were in the Divide into lifeless zombies.
Soldiers of the Bear died here. Legion died too. My brothers, still dying. Both of them, all around us. None of the people that lived here survived. Yet all of the West and the East, they hold on as the Divide tears at them.
After this event, Ulysses is obviously distraught and travels away, and in this, he discovers the Whitelegs tribe. This is the tribe of people that you fight against in the Honest Heart DLC. He attempts to show them the way of Caesar, and in doing so, they begin to fall under Caesar's spell of power. This is the reason why you and Joshua Graham fight them in the Honest Hearts DLC. The Whitelegs also start to really admire Ulysses. In admiration of Ulysses, they begin to curl their hair like his. This is something that you can see them doing in the DLC when you visit them. But this makes Ulysses realize something, as he's erasing the Whitelegs and their history, just as Caesar had done to his original tribe that he was born in. And in colonizing the Whitelegs, he begins to realize why Caesar's way of thought was wrong. And so he decides to venture out and find his own path. And in his journey, Ulysses carries the flag of the old world that he found in the Divide, as he believes understanding the world that once was will help him understand the truth about the world that surrounds him. That's when him and Christine from the Dead Money DLC become pretty good friends.
A courier wore an old world flag on his back. He was the one who pulled me out there. That's who he was hunting for. Some courier.
He also meets with Father Elijah of that same DLC. Something that you find out in Dead Money that I didn't mention is that Christine was sent by the Brotherhood of Steel to kill Father Elijah for abandoning the Brotherhood. You find this out after restoring her voice, which is a twist I didn't spoil until now because of how closely it's tied into Ulysses' story.
Then he became unstable, left a trail of crimes across the wasteland. Once word reached us, I was ordered to kill him.
So in meeting both Christine and Father Elijah, Ulysses sort of realizes that the Brotherhood of Steel has faults as well. And thus, along with the NCR and Caesar's Legion, he crosses off the Brotherhood on his list of factions that he thinks has the ability to bring the Mojave together. And just a quick reminder, Ulysses is against the NCR because of course he was once in Caesar's Legion, and so he truly understands why they are bad as well. Ulysses then discovers the think tank from the Old World Blues DLC. Father Elijah told Ulysses to come here because Ulysses wanted to find some embodiment of the minds that existed before the war. In the think tank though, he discovers how truly wrong and honestly stupid some of the scientists were from before the bombs dropped. And this is where he sort of loses hope in finding a sort of truthful ideology that existed before the Great War and the bombs dropped.
What you did was for the best. The old world died long ago.
And as I'll mention a bit later, this analysis of the old world also includes other figures in the game like Mr. House.
If you saw a house, you didn't see a man. An old world spirit, perhaps. Filthy, diseased. If so, killing him was mercy, not cruelty.
It seems like every single place he goes to find some sort of answer, some reason, it's all just fruitless. And thus he finally goes back to the Divide, the symbolic destruction that was created by two big factions of the Mojave. And in the Divide, there are still bombs that Ulysses can use to destroy the Mojave Desert and destroy factions like the NCR and Caesar's Legion that he thinks are doing more harm than good. This leads you, the player, to Ulysses. And it turns out that luring the player to him was actually a plan by Ulysses himself this whole time. And it also turns out that you, the player, were actually the courier that delivered the codes that blew up the Divide to begin with.
Before you lies your work, the history you burned in the earth, what you brought to the people here. You delivered a package, had markings that matched those in the Divide. Military markings from someplace the bear had savaged in the west. It was a device, a detonator. You carried that thing to the Divide. I know because I followed you. You brought it here, to the community you built. And you are responsible for what happened after. Those missiles you've seen, buried in their silos. They exploded beneath the ground, cracked the landscape. Sand, ash, should have died there. Your package, the message inside, awoke medical machines. Maybe they saw the flag on my jacket, thought I was of America. If so, history saved me. Revenge isn't the message I have for you. More than that, courier.
You were the person that started Ulysses' whole journey. So Ulysses as a character is the most unique of anybody in the entirety of Fallout New Vegas. He's so important because unlike all of the other characters in the game that are pretty much just typical NPCs, the game treats Ulysses like he's just another player character. It's shown to you, the player, that he went through many of the same situations and settings that you went through. And just like you, he has a really unique and individual view on the politics of Fallout New Vegas. He doesn't abide by any single faction, and again, he's treated just like another player. His views amount to this: the NCR is bad because it's disorganized, and they represent the governments from before the war that ultimately led us to go into war to begin with. He got this view from being a part of Caesar's Legion at the start of his story. Yet, Caesar's Legion's main purpose is to grow and grow until there's nothing else it can take control of. And then Caesar's Legion will have nothing to do other than eat itself from the inside out. To describe these two main factions, Ulysses uses this continual metaphor of the bear and bull, the NCR and Legion.
Got what they deserved, coming to the Divide. The bear and bull. NCR, Legion. Came in waves, once under different flags. Now they are equal in their hatred of the trespassers.
The NCR is a bear, of course represented on their flag, but also in the way that they conquer. Despite taking a lot of territory, they never truly have control of any part of it, their lack of aggression being a sort of downfall for their ideology.
All that's been built since America died. Same symbols as before the war. Now a flag carried by a tribe of children. The bear grows without structure, follows a symbol without knowing its history. Without NCR to support it, Vegas will fall to the Legion. No need to destroy the bear. Just cut its throat. It's custom of the bear. to never see the marks it claws in the land. Not my custom.
And then Caesar's Legion is the bull, which is also represented on their flag. It's insanely aggressive and mean, and it tries to take all that it can until it can't take any more, in which it will end up sort of hurting itself in its own confusion. Oh my god, was that a fucking Pokemon reference?
Walked east too, before the bull came. Then, much like Mojave before the bear, tribes, towns, clutching to life. Bull did a better job. The dam, that old world wall, but once found, it was all Caesar could see. That, and the flag beyond it, another symbol, big enough to challenge him. And the divide, one of the roads to it. Legion was tasked with cutting that artery. If you can't kill the bear in one stroke, bleed it, starve it.
Okay, so there's no need to have a section in this video where I have a conclusion about all the DLC as a whole, because Lonesome Road really already does that for me. Lonesome Road takes the journey that you went through in both the base game and all of the DLC, and shows you this destructive way of thought that somebody had picked up by experiencing all the things that you had. Ulysses basically experiences everything that you do, yet in doing so he develops this way of thought that, as you can tell, he just hates everybody. Even though this is an RPG, and obviously you can just shoot and kill Ulysses so that he doesn't accomplish his final goal of blowing out the Mojave with his giant missile, because he views all the main factions as terrible and corrupt, it's obvious that the good ending of Lonesome Road, and the ending that I think everybody likely agrees with, is the one where you help Ulysses to see how he's been wrong, and how even more destructive it will be if he causes more damage. It's imperative to the goal of the story of Fallout New Vegas to understand that Ulysses is not entirely wrong. What he believes, his views on both Caesar's Legion, the NCR, the Brotherhood of Steel, and all the other governments and scientists that happened before the bombs dropped, his opinions on everything is partially correct. All of the factions and groups are somewhat flawed and corrupt. They all play off of man's biggest flaws, and the greed and power that underlines everything in the world. Yet in viewing the world this way, he becomes saddened and corrupt himself. He thinks that the only way to reset everything is to completely demolish all of man's accomplishments, both the good and the bad. But in doing so, he becomes no better than the people that set off the bombs that destroyed the world in the first place. So as you can tell, we're on the verge of breaking through the ice, and seeing what the developers are truly trying to achieve with this masterpiece of a game. Fallout New Vegas is trying to say something really important here. In the next segment of this video is where I'm going to describe the true point of Fallout New Vegas. If the developers of this game had some sort of final symbolic message to share, then what would it be? Well, here's my answer to that question. Here's what I think the meaning behind Fallout New Vegas is. To be honest, I think everything that I've mentioned up to this point was just some sort of silly way for me to describe all the amazing things that I love about Fallout and Fallout New Vegas. Yes, I enjoy the meaning of the game, but more so, I enjoy what the game does to display this message. As I have sort of alluded to before, I think that all the key messages behind this game lie in its final puzzle piece. You could go through the Legion, the NCR, Yes Man, and Mr. House storylines, all of which have their own outlook on the world and the proper way it should be managed. In this sense, most players, especially those who don't play the DLC, will tend to sort of stick with the ideals of whichever faction's ending they choose. For the majority of players, this side is obviously the NCR, and I'll admit, at first I thought that the NCR were obviously the good guys, and the people that the developers were saying should truly run the Mojave. Even though the NCR is clearly Obsidian's favorite faction, it's still far from the most morally just, as I've described throughout this video. Yet after looking at all of the different paths you can go down and completing all the 4 DLC, when you reach Ulysses in his cave, you're met with a final perspective. I don't like calling it the centrist perspective because it's a lot more than that, but at the same time, it's this perspective that sees how basically everybody in the whole world has it wrong. Only you and Ulysses have the ability to see beyond the petty groups and factions of the Mojave. Instead standing there at the end of the DLC, only you and him sort of can see why everything around you has happened to begin with. As summarized in the last segment, Ulysses disagrees with every main faction in the game. The Bear and the Bull, the NCR and Caesar. He has very clear reasons why they're flawed. Ulysses doesn't specifically mention Mr. House, Yes Man, or the Brotherhood as much as the Bear and Bull, but through his story we can see why he disagrees with them as well. The Brotherhood and Mr. House are flag bearers of the past. Just like the NCR, they're pushing messages and agendas that have failed before them. And the sort of anarchist Yes Man, although many people would think that this would be Ulysses' ideal faction, I think that the Yes Man in Ulysses' eyes would just be a joke. The Yes Man is possibly making good decisions, but at the same time, Yes Man and this ending, you and the Yes Man don't have a really great understanding of your actions and the purpose behind it all. What does this mean? Why does this matter? Okay, so in each individual big story throughout the game that Ulysses and the main character observe, we can see the downfall of each one of the main groups and factions in the Mojave. The destroyed lonesome road civilizations, the weird sickness that it feels like every single faction in the game has. We can see how even though all of them have good intentions, most of them ultimately ruin themselves by sticking to their own path. Only occasionally, like the Boomers and Brotherhood of Steel quest lines, can you really see how breaking free from one's own expectations is the way for them to succeed as a whole. The NCR fails because they want to take in a ton of power, but they can't control the land and people that they obtain. Caesar's Legion fails because it's so hellbent on conquering and obtaining land that once its goal is met, it falls into itself and collapses. For instance, in the NCR ending, the only way that the Brotherhood survives this game is if they end their hatred for the NCR and they agree to work with one another on each other's terms. This game honestly doesn't present many good outcomes for the world, and similar to the dark, depressing themes that the game sets up in its atmosphere and the 3 layers of immersion, it's impossible to break from the bleak outlook of life of the Mojave in terms of the main point of the game. So anyways, my thesis for the meaning behind Fallout New Vegas, if I had to put it into a single sentence, would be: the nature of man is to gain power. Social, political, even economic. Yet the path to get this power leads to moral blindness, where you start to overlook the flaws in your own beliefs or ideology. Even though power makes it easy to overlook your imperfections, these imperfections that you have are what leads to one's own demise. This one sentence is what I've sort of boiled down through the last hour or so of this video. This is the key idea I see repeated over and over again. Every faction in this game is ambitious as hell. They want things, they want outcomes, they want other people to see the world how they do, and shape it into their own perfect image of what a utopian society would be. The NCR, the Brotherhood, Caesar, Mr. House, and even Ulysses. They all want the world to be a certain way, and they have this ambitious pursuit of whatever ideology that drives them. What drives almost everyone in the whole series is obviously power. The power of land and manpower like Caesar. The power of stable functional governments like the NCR. The power of technology of the past. The power to control the outcome of the future. I don't think that you can completely dismantle every faction or group's ideas in this game, but at the same time, they all strive for control of a land that was once stripped of all control when the bombs dropped. The power struggle that went on before the bombs dropped is the deeper lore. It's the first layer of immersion. And if you remember that layers of immersion discussed from all the way at the first part of this video, even though the first layer is very disconnected from the gameplay, it's what sets up all of the factions and storylines that continue throughout all of the games. Before the bombs dropped, there was a huge power struggle in the world. The struggle for power ended up nuking the entire world. And through this destruction of the entire world, we see how the strive to get power in the old world governments is what ultimately led to the destruction of the entire power structure of the world. And in its ashes, even more factions and groups came up wanting the power that they saw in the land. And of course, in the main games, even though you can agree with a faction, you can agree with their ideology, even if you can agree with them, you can still see how the flaws that are inherent in every single faction are all there because they've had this sort of blindness caused by the fact that they need this power. Ulysses is one of the only standouts. He doesn't necessarily want power as much as he's disgusted by the factions that are so driven for it. Yet again, once again in this ideology to strip others of their power, he wants to destroy the entirety of the Mojave with a missile, killing all of the good and bad people in the land. I think that I've attacked every single viewpoint of the Mojave Desert individually at some point of this video of mine. From the start to the finish, littered throughout, you can see me attacking every individual faction somehow. And I think that's what makes every single faction in this game so appealing, why I want to go back and discover more about them. Because even though they are flawed, I can say at the core of every single group is some sort of idea of a utopia, a world where everybody can live happily and be in some sort of peace. Yet their ambitious growth for power to spread this idea corrupts them, leaves them disorganized and chaotic, and leads to the downfall of every single faction in this game. The message of Fallout New Vegas is what you want it to be, and your individual experiences with the game is what gives you your own conclusion. As once again, somebody may play through the NCR questline, think that they're 100% right, and that's what they take out as the meaning of Fallout New Vegas. Yet after looking in depth about every part of this game, this is what I came up with, and this is what I think the developers and writers meant when they put this game up on a shelf for people to play. Fallout New Vegas does this better than any other Fallout game. The original developers of Fallout 1 and 2 were of course many of the people who later formed Obsidian and made Fallout New Vegas, and thus they're tied so deeply to what they wanted this game to be from the very, very start. The Fallout series, it's a critique of mankind's ambitions and pursuit of power, and how any ideology, no matter how pure, can be corrupted, with the only way to truly solve the problems of the world being to make amends. If everybody reached out to others, like how the courier reached out to Ulysses to save his life, then the world would be a much better place.
It may be that as much destruction has been written in the earth here, you have spoken truly. There is a shadow of a nation behind you, the hope of a people.
Every single faction that has a good ending in this game has a good ending because you're able to change their mind. You make them realize that peace is possible, and even though their ideologies are important, when they make this peace and have an active discussion with one another, it's when progress is actually made, and it's how they actually save lives instead of harming them. In all, I'm a big fucking nerd, and Fallout New Vegas is really fucking cool and made me think a lot more than I bet the developers were intending. And that's the end of what I have to say. It's time for some conclusions and some little deeper talks, but that's what I think about Fallout New Vegas. Thank you guys for watching. Fallout New Vegas is a cool fucking game. I love almost everything that the game does. The dialogue is unbelievably witty. There are so many systems in line that make it feel like you do something that affects another thing. And the story has this wave of nuance that's just, I don't know, it's fucking amazing. The story of the game can be put under so many different types of interpretation, but at the same time, it burns so slowly as you play through it that by the end you don't realize it, but you just have amassed this collection of stories that make your character have its own identity. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and after watching it, I hope you go and play through Fallout New Vegas if you haven't before, and if you already have, I hope that you pick it back up and just do another playthrough. I don't really know how to make this conclusion, because this whole video is just saying why I love Fallout, and it's something I've wanted to make ever since I fell in love with the series back in middle school. So yeah, anyways, thank you guys so much for sticking around to the very end. If you're new to my channel and this is your first way that you've ever seen me, I hope that you stay because there's many other videos like this, although maybe a bit shorter, that I want to make in the future. I mentioned how long this video took me to make, you know, like in the introduction and whatnot, but legitimately this was a year of my life of just continuously editing and thinking, and even though I did take long breaks of editing this video where I could have probably gotten it out sooner, it still has sort of taken up so much of the last year of my life. In particular, last year was my final senior year of high school, and I'm going off to college now. I don't know exactly how these videos and my life is gonna change going into college literally in the next 2 weeks, but at the same time, I'm very happy that for the last year of my life, I've been able to make something so big with my time. I've always liked making videos, and I would always sort of stretch them longer and longer. At first, I'd release maybe an 8-minute video about, like, God of War or something, and then, oh my gosh, I made a 20-minute video about Yooka-Laylee, and then next thing you know, I make that, like, 36-minute video about Ghost of Tsushima, and I think, wow, this is the furthest I've gone, this is the longest video I've ever made. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to make something longer than that. Well, now I have a 3-hour fucking movie to show off my abilities to analyze video games and edit and just sort of go through this really long, rigorous process. The script alone took me months to make, I think maybe 2 or 3 straight. I didn't start editing the video itself until I was done with the script, and I spent many long days just looking over the script and adding on as I thought more and more about the game and what I had experienced. Fallout New Vegas is my favorite game of all time, and of course I can talk for hours and hours about like any video game that I really like, but Fallout New Vegas specifically does so many things that I feel aren't talked about enough. This is really funny because Starfield actually just came out within like the last week or so of me editing this video, and it's really funny because I see people praising Starfield for so many things that I think were sort of started almost all the way back in Fallout New Vegas. Legitimately, this was the biggest year of change that my life has undergone in terms of relationships and just like the things that I want to do with my life. I now sort of have a more set path than I did than when I started editing this video. And because of that, even though this is just a video about a video game, because it took so long, I can sort of feel exactly what I was going through at the times where I was editing, let's say, the first part about the 3 layers all the way down to talking about the DLC of Fallout New Vegas. I know I'm yapping on and on, but thank you guys so much for watching this video. Thank you so much for supporting my channel. Thank you so much. Please subscribe and like if you've made it all the way here. I do have a general idea of some of the videos that I want to make in the coming weeks and months, but actually more than that, I want to start writing more because I sort of gave up my website and writing articles in favor of editing this monstrosity. So anyways, expect more videos, expect more writing. I'm not too sure what my schedule is going to be like in the future because of course I'm going to college, but anyways, the video's over now. And here's what I promised at the very start, a little musical number, because I don't know, it's almost like a present for the people who have watched the video all the way up to this point, so
how lucky can one guy be? I kissed her and she kissed me. Like the fella once said, ain't that a kick in the head? The room was completely black. I hugged her and she hugged back. Like the sailor said, quote, ain't that a hole in the boat? My head keeps spinning. I go to sleep and keep grinning. If this is just the beginning, my life is gonna be beautiful. I've sunshine enough to spread. It's just like the fella said. Tell me quick, ain't love a kick in the head? Like the fellow once said, ain't that a kick in the head? Like the sailor said, quote, ain't that a hole in a boat? My head keeps spinning. I go to sleep and keep grinning. If this is just the beginning, my life is gonna be beautiful. She's telling me we'll be wed. She's picked out a king-size bed. I couldn't feel any better or I'd be sick. Tell me quick, oh, ain't love a kick? Tell me quick, ain't love a kick in the head?
Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Telephone.